Do you ever feel like people in power control your life, not through laws or police, but through health and medicine? Think back to the pandemic. Think about lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine passes, debates over who had the right to decide what you could put into your own body. For some, these were necessary measures to protect lives. For others, they felt like overreach, like governments stepping deeper into the most intimate parts of existence. But whichever side you fell on, one truth became hard to deny: our bodies had become political territory. This may feel new, a product of modern crises and technology, but in fact, one man saw it coming decades ago. His name was Michel Foucault, a French philosopher whose writings still unsettle readers with their clarity and daring. Long before COVID-19, before mass vaccination debates, before biometric tracking and digital health passports, Foucault argued that power had shifted. No longer was it only about kings and presidents, about executions and prisons. Power, he claimed, now worked through biology, through health, disease, sexuality, and medicine. He called this biopower, the management of life itself. Pause, and think about that term, biopower. It sounds abstract, academic, maybe even distant. But what Foucault meant was chillingly simple. He believed that modern governments don't just rule over citizens, they regulate populations. They decide who gets to live long, who gets treatment, who bears more risk, whose bodies are protected, and whose are left exposed. Public health, in his eyes, was never neutral. It was always a tool of control. When a society insists on regulating birth rates, monitoring sexual behavior, organizing vaccinations, or managing pandemics, it is exercising biopower. Not necessarily maliciously, but always with consequences. What troubled him was the hidden politics of medicine, the way health became a justification for new forms of surveillance, new regulations, new boundaries between the normal and the abnormal. Consider how, in the 18th and 19th centuries, hospitals were reorganized not simply to treat patients, but to categorize them, to measure, to observe. The medical chart, the diagnosis, the statistics. These were, to Foucault, the birth of a new way of governing, not by law, but by health. Fast forward to our own time. Ask yourself, how often do you surrender personal data in the name of health? Fitness trackers, insurance incentives, DNA tests, vaccine registries. Each of these promises care, but also collects information. Each is part of a system where your body is not just your own, but a site of governance. When governments lock down entire populations, they are not exercising the old power of kings who could execute with a command. They are exercising the modern power to make live and let die, as Foucault put it. They preserve some lives while exposing others to risk, often according to hidden hierarchies of value. It is here that Foucault's work becomes controversial. He forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Do health policies protect us, or do they discipline us? When a state insists on mass vaccination, is it safeguarding life or asserting control? When it decides which diseases get funding and which communities are left behind, is that neutral science or political strategy? Foucault does not offer simple answers. Instead, he pulls back the curtain, showing that what looks like compassion is often intertwined with control. And this is why his ideas remain so electrifying today. At a time when debates rage about bodily autonomy, whether over abortion, vaccines, gender identity, or medical privacy, Foucault reminds us that these questions are not just personal, they are political. They reveal the deep ways in which power operates not above us, but through us, through our flesh, our habits, our health, even our sense of self. But who was this man who could see all of this so clearly? Michel Foucault was not a detached academic sitting in an ivory tower. He was a restless, radical spirit who lived through wars, revolts, and revolutions. He was a man marked by depression and alienation who sought in philosophy both a weapon and a mirror. He was openly gay in a time when it was dangerous, and he immersed himself in the very subcultures, madness, sexuality, prisons, that polite society shunned. His life was as provocative as his work. When we trace his story, we see not just a thinker but a man who lived the very contradictions he studied. He walked the line between brilliance and breakdown, between intellectual rigor and dangerous excess. He wrote about madness while feeling its pull. He analyzed prisons while protesting outside their gates. He dissected sexuality while living in ways that scandalized his contemporaries. And in his final years, he confronted AIDS, one of the very forces of biopolitics he had described, the regulation of life and death through disease. So, let us return to that first question. Do you feel controlled through health and medicine? Whether you answer yes or no, you are already inside Foucault's world. A world where freedom and power are more complicated than they seem. A world where the hospital, the school, the prison, and even your bedroom are arenas of politics. A world where the state no longer simply punishes, but manages life itself. In this documentary, we will follow Foucault's journey, from his lonely childhood in provincial France, to his studies of madness, to his radical explorations of prisons, sexuality, and health. We will see how his philosophy grew not from abstract speculation, but from lived experience, from engagement with the darkest and most hidden corners of society. And we will ask, again and again, what does his vision mean for us now, in an age where technology and medicine reach further into our lives than ever before? Because if Foucault is right, then the question is not whether we are controlled through health and medicine. The question is how much, and whether we can resist. Michel Foucault was born in 1926 in Poitiers, a quiet provincial town in western France. At first glance, there was little in his surroundings to suggest the radical thinker he would become. His father, Paul Foucault, was a respected surgeon, a man of science and order, devoted to medicine. His mother, Anne Malapert, came from a wealthy local family. In many ways, Michel's childhood was marked by the expectation of continuity. He was meant to follow in his father's footsteps, to enter medicine, to carry on a life of prestige and stability. But, beneath the calm surface, there were cracks. The young Michel was restless, often anxious, and deeply aware of the weight of expectations pressing upon him. He would later describe his childhood as one of distance, not a warm immersion in family life, but a kind of discipline by tradition. In a way, it mirrored what he would later write about institutions, that they are spaces of rules, hierarchies, and silent pressures, shaping lives even before words are spoken. The city of Poitiers itself carried its own paradoxes. With its ancient churches, medieval streets, and conservative culture, it was a place steeped in tradition. Yet this was also interwar France, a nation still reeling from World War I, unsure of its future and increasingly polarized politically. Michel's own father, as a surgeon, represented science and rational order. But the broader society around them still clung to Catholic conservatism. The boy grew up between these two poles. On one side, the strict rationality of medicine, on the other, the moral authority of the church. It was a tension that would never leave him. As a child, Michel was bright, but also troubled. Teachers noticed his intelligence early, but they also saw signs of something darker. He was moody, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes prone to violent outbursts of anger. Later, biographers would note that these early patterns foreshadowed his lifelong struggles with depression and instability. His peers often mocked him, not only for being different, but for his perceived arrogance. One classmate recalled him as both brilliant and aloof, the boy who always seemed older than the rest of us. This alienation was sharpened by the expectations of his family. His father wanted him to become a doctor, like himself. Medicine was not just a profession, it was a family identity, a legacy. But Michel resisted. He was fascinated not by fixing bodies, but by exploring the workings of the mind, the cracks in reason, the edges of human experience. Already, he was drawn to what others avoided: madness, death, the unspoken. In the shadow of a surgeon's household, he grew increasingly curious about what lay beyond the neat boundaries of science. It is worth pausing here to notice something. In many biographies of philosophers, childhood can feel like a prelude, a set of trivial details before the real. Story begins. But with Foucault, his early life matters. It mattered that he was the son of a surgeon, steeped in medicine but skeptical of its authority. It mattered that he was raised in a conservative Catholic environment, only to later reject both its faith and its moral constraints. It mattered that he felt alienated and pressured, because these experiences would become the soil from which his philosophy grew. When he later wrote about the medical gaze, about how institutions impose order and silence on individuals, he was not speaking only as a historian. He was remembering what it felt like to be a child under watchful eyes, measured against standards he never chose. World War II cast its shadow over Michel's adolescence. When he was 13, Nazi Germany invaded France. Poitiers fell under occupation, and young Michel grew up in a world marked by fear, censorship, and collaboration. His family, like many others, endured the humiliations of defeat, the shortages, the restrictions. For a boy already aware of authority and discipline, the presence of German troops in his hometown must have felt like an external confirmation of what he already sensed internally. That power is not just a matter of laws, but of daily life, shaping where you walk, what you say, even what you think. Later, when he analyzed prisons and surveillance, he was drawing on the lived experience of a society where even the most ordinary freedoms could vanish overnight. Yet amid this atmosphere, Michel's intellectual brilliance continued to shine. He read voraciously, exploring not just the classics assigned in school, but also literature and philosophy that stretched beyond the conservative curriculum. Nietzsche would eventually become one of his guiding lights, but already as a teenager, he was drawn to writers who questioned norms and exposed hypocrisy. Friends recalled him as someone who devoured books, who seemed always hungry for knowledge, but also someone tormented by what he discovered. Knowledge for Michel was never simply comforting, it was unsettling, disruptive. It is easy, from the vantage point of his later fame, to see in the young Michel Foucault the seeds of the thinker he would become. The boy who resisted his father's discipline would become the philosopher who exposed discipline as a form of power. The teenager who endured war and occupation would become the historian who revealed how institutions internalize authority. The young man who felt isolated, mocked, and pressured would become the intellectual who sided with those society excluded, the mad, the imprisoned, the marginalized. In his childhood, we see not just biography but philosophy in embryo. And yet, he was still just a boy, fragile, insecure, uncertain. Behind the image of the brilliant student was someone deeply troubled, someone who often felt he did not belong. His later struggles with depression, self-harm, and identity can already be traced to these early years. This is important because it reminds us, Foucault was not an abstract machine of ideas. He was a man whose philosophy grew out of pain as much as intellect. His early life in Poitiers gave him the vantage point of an outsider, someone who knew what it was like to be watched, judged, and disciplined, but who also sensed that these forces could be resisted, questioned, exposed. By the time he left Poitiers for Paris, Michel was already determined not to become his father's son in the traditional sense. He would not mend bodies with scalpels, he would dissect the world with thought. And that determination was the beginning of the journey that would take him from provincial France to the center of the intellectual world. When Michel Foucault entered the École Normale Supérieure, ENS, in 1946, he stepped into the most prestigious intellectual institution in France. For generations, ENS had been the training ground for the nation's philosophers, writers, and politicians. To be accepted was a mark of brilliance, but it also carried the weight of tradition. The school was both a sanctuary of ideas and a crucible of intense competition. For Foucault, who had grown up in the provincial quiet of Poitiers, Paris offered both liberation and new forms of pressure. The France he arrived in was still reeling from the devastation of World War II. German occupation had left scars on its institutions and psyche. The resistance, the Vichy regime, collaboration, betrayal, all of these were fresh memories. The universities buzzed with political debate. Students argued in cafes about communism, fascism, Catholicism, and the future of democracy. To walk through the streets of Paris was to feel history pressing against the present. For a restless young man like Foucault, it was intoxicating. At ENS, Michel threw himself into philosophy. The curriculum was demanding. Students were expected to master the classics of Descartes, Kant, and Hegel, but also to grapple with contemporary debates. Professors drilled students in logic, metaphysics, and epistemology. Foucault excelled, but he also gravitated toward disciplines outside strict philosophy. He became fascinated with psychology and psychiatry, areas that allowed him to explore questions of the mind, madness, and identity. He also pursued history, literature, and medicine, not to practice them, but to understand how they defined human beings. It was during these years that Foucault encountered some of the thinkers who would shape his trajectory. Friedrich Nietzsche, with his radical questioning of morality and truth, became a lifelong influence. Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God and his suspicion of absolute truths resonated with Foucault's own instincts. Martin Heidegger, with his exploration of existence and being, provided another set of tools. Sigmund Freud, with his excavation of the unconscious, showed how hidden structures shape the self. And Karl Marx, though Foucault never became a Marxist, taught him to see history as a struggle, not of ideas alone, but of material forces and power. Foucault's brilliance, however, came with turbulence. He was not the serene, detached student some might imagine. He suffered from deep depression, marked by self-doubt and alienation. Accounts from classmates describe him as both dazzling and unstable, capable of sharp wit and keen insight one moment, and then withdrawn and volatile the next. He engaged in self-destructive behavior, at times pushing himself to the brink. It was during these years that he made his first suicide attempts. These struggles were not incidental. They were woven into his intellectual journey. For Foucault, philosophy was not an escape from suffering, but a way of wrestling with it. Another source of difficulty was his sexuality. In the conservative climate of post-war France, homosexuality was stigmatized and dangerous. At ENS, Foucault experienced both discovery and fear. He found relationships and circles where he could express himself more freely, but he also endured mockery, rejection, and hostility. His openness, rare at the time, made him a target. This tension between desire and repression would become central to his later philosophy. His insistence that sexuality is not merely biological, but shaped by discourse and power, grew directly out of these lived experiences. But ENS was not only a site of struggle, it was also where Foucault began to find his voice. He explored libraries obsessively, diving into historical texts on medicine, madness, and punishment. He was fascinated by how ideas changed over time, not simply because new discoveries were made, but because societies themselves shifted in how they defined truth. Why was madness seen one way in the Middle Ages and another in the modern age? Why were bodies treated one way in religious discourse and another in medical practice? These questions planted the seeds for his later works. The intellectual atmosphere at ENS was electric. Students debated not just ideas, but politics, ethics, and the role of the intellectual in society. This was the age of Jean-Paul Sartre, the towering figure of existentialism, whose writings on freedom and responsibility dominated the cultural scene. Sartre represented a model of the engaged philosopher, someone who did not just interpret the world, but intervened in it. Foucault admired Sartre's energy, but remained wary of his existential humanism. Already, Foucault was drifting toward a view of philosophy that questioned the very foundations of the human, as a stable concept. Yet even in his divergence, he absorbed the sense that philosophy must matter, must connect to the real struggles of the world. At ENS, he was not just learning theories, he was being forged into an intellectual who would one day challenge the boundaries of philosophy itself. Still, it would be wrong to romanticize these years. Foucault's brilliance coexisted with pain. His struggles with mental health led him to psychiatric treatments, some harsh by today's standards. He experienced firsthand the very institutions he would later critique. It is striking to realize, when Foucault wrote about madness, prisons, and sexuality, he was not just an observer. He was someone who had lived close to their margins, who knew from experience what it was to feel excluded, pathologized, or controlled. By the time he completed his studies at ENS, Foucault had distinguished himself as a thinker of rare originality. He was not yet the Foucault who would write Madness and Civilization or Discipline and Punish, but the outlines were forming. He had absorbed philosophy, psychology, and history. He had wrestled with despair and identity. He had glimpsed the hidden structures of knowledge and power that defined people's lives. And most importantly, he had begun to see that philosophy was not about eternal truths, but about the shifting rules that govern what societies take as truth. In retrospect, we can see ENS as the crucible of Foucault's life. It gave him tools, but it also tested him. It introduced him to the thinkers he would later reinterpret, and it confronted him with the personal battles that would shape his vision. It was here that he learned not just to read philosophy, but to live it, to confront the abyss of despair and still persist, to face the weight of social judgment and still seek freedom. From here, Michel Foucault would step into the broader intellectual world, carrying both the brilliance and the scars of his student years. The journey ahead would take him into even darker struggles, but also into the discoveries that would make him one of the most influential thinkers of the modern era. For all his brilliance, Michel Foucault's early adulthood was marked by pain so intense that it nearly ended his life more than once. These were his dark years, a period of struggle with depression, repeated suicide attempts, and the difficulty of being a gay man in post-war France. To understand his later philosophy, we must confront this part of his story honestly, because it is here that his preoccupation with madness, exclusion, and control became not just intellectual curiosities, but personal realities. At the École Normale Supérieure, Foucault was already known as a brilliant but troubled student. Behind the sharp wit and the dazzling intelligence lay deep instability. He was moody, prone to violent shifts in temperament. Friends and professors alike noticed his intensity, but also his volatility. Several times he attempted suicide. Accounts vary. Some suggest slashing his chest, others that he sought death in more desperate ways, but all agree that these were not idle gestures. They were expressions of genuine despair. Depression, in Foucault's time, carried heavy stigma. Mental illness was not widely discussed, and those who suffered often did so in silence. For someone like Foucault, already marked as different by his sexuality and personality, the weight was heavier. Psychiatry, which fascinated him intellectually, was also something he encountered personally, as he underwent treatments intended to stabilize him. Some biographers have suggested that these experiences, being subjected to psychiatric authority, gave him a visceral sense of how institutions exert control under the guise of care. Later, when he wrote about madness being defined and confined by society, he was not speaking abstractly. He was writing as someone who had felt the institution's gaze upon himself. His homosexuality compounded his sense of alienation. In post-war France, homosexuality was not openly accepted. It was often ridiculed, criminalized, or pathologized. At ENS, Michel found relationships, but they were shadowed by stigma. Classmates mocked him, sometimes cruelly. Professors looked at him with suspicion. His openness, rare for the time, made him vulnerable. In an environment that prized conformity, he stood out as someone who refused to conceal who he was, even at great personal cost. It is difficult to overstate how dangerous this was. Homosexuality was widely considered an illness, a deviation. Medical discourse classified it as abnormal, something to be treated or corrected. Foucault, immersed in psychology and psychiatry, would have been acutely aware of how the very disciplines he studied categorized people like him as pathological. To live under such a definition was to live under a shadow of exclusion, always at risk of being dismissed, not just as different, but as sick. And yet, instead of retreating, Foucault leaned into these tensions. He became fascinated by the very categories that oppressed him. Why, he asked, do societies define certain behaviors as normal and others as deviant? Why do they isolate the mad, the criminal, the homosexual? Why do they claim to be protecting society, when in fact they are enforcing conformity? These questions were not academic games. They were born of his lived reality as someone who had experienced both rejection and the threat of institutional control. The darkness of these years also shaped Foucault's attitude toward philosophy itself. For many, philosophy is an abstract pursuit, a search for truth and ideas. For Foucault, it was a matter of survival. To wrestle with Nietzsche, Freud, and Heidegger was not merely to pass exams, it was to find tools to understand and endure his own existence. Nietzsche's suspicion of morality, Freud's excavation of desire, Heidegger's confrontation with nothingness. These were lifelines for a young man struggling with despair. They gave him a way to transform pain into insight, isolation into perspective. But it would be wrong to imagine that Foucault emerged from these struggles unscathed. He carried the scars of this period throughout his life. His fascination with madness was not just historical curiosity, it was empathy. His distrust of psychiatry was not theoretical, it was grounded in personal experience. His skepticism of categories like normal and healthy was not detached, it was rooted in knowing how easily they could become weapons. And yet, out of these struggles, Foucault developed resilience. He began to understand that what society called madness, deviance, or illness was often simply a reflection of power. This realization planted the seeds for his first major work, Madness and Civilization. But before he could write it, he had to endure more years of wandering, of teaching abroad, of refining his method. These dark years humanize him. They remind us that philosophy does not arise only from libraries and lectures, but from pain, rejection, and survival. When Foucault later wrote about power reaching into the body, about institutions shaping identity, about sexuality being constructed and controlled, he was speaking as someone who had lived at the margins of those categories. His life was not a retreat from the world, but an immersion in its most punishing edges. For listeners today, there is something strikingly modern in this part of his story. Mental health, sexuality, stigma. These remain pressing issues. Foucault's struggles resonate with anyone who has felt defined by categories they did not choose, or who has confronted institutions that claim to help, but also constrain. His dark years remind us that philosophy is not just abstract speculation, it is a way of wrestling with life's most difficult truths. By the early 1950s, Michel Foucault had survived his crises but not escaped them. He carried his pain with him, transforming it into a lens through which to view society. The stage was set for his first great breakthrough, the writing of Madness and Civilization, where the questions that haunted him would be turned into a history of how societies define and confine those they call mad. In 1961, Michel Foucault published his first major work, Madness and Civilization. It was not just an academic book, it was a declaration, an excavation of how societies treat those they call mad. The work announced Foucault as a radical new voice in philosophy and history, and it captured the attention of readers far beyond the university walls. It was also deeply personal, born out of the struggles we've already seen in his own life. At first glance, the book seemed like history. It traced how Western societies, from the Middle Ages to the modern era, had understood and treated madness. But Foucault's approach was different. He did not tell a story of progress, of medieval ignorance gradually replaced by scientific enlightenment. Instead, he revealed how the very categories of reason and madness were constructed. What counted as sanity in one age could be defined as insanity in another. Madness, he argued, was not a fixed condition but a label, a boundary society drew to protect its sense of order. The book begins in the Middle Ages, when madness was often woven into the fabric of life. The mad were sometimes seen as touched by the divine, or as figures of comedy and chaos who nonetheless belonged to the community. But with the rise of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, something changed. Societies began to confine the mad. In the 17th century, the creation of the Great Confinement swept not only the insane, but also the poor, the unemployed, and the criminal into institutions. Madness was no longer a voice at the margins, it was silenced, shut away. This shift, for Foucault, was not about medical progress. It was about power. The confinement of the mad was less about healing and more about social control. By locking up those who did not conform, societies defined themselves as rational, ordered, and normal. The asylum, then, was not just a place of treatment, but a place of exclusion, a way of drawing a line between the acceptable and the unacceptable. One of Foucault's most provocative claims was that psychiatry itself emerged not as pure science, but as part of this history of exclusion. Doctors became the arbiters of reason, endowed with the authority to decide who was sane and who was not. The medical gaze, as he would later call it, was not neutral. It was an instrument of power, a way of categorizing and controlling individuals. When a psychiatrist declared someone insane, it was not simply a description. It was an act that reshaped that person's life, stripping them of autonomy, locking them within a system. This argument was unsettling, and it remains so. It undermined the comforting narrative that science steadily progresses toward truth. Instead, Foucault suggested that knowledge is always entangled with power. What we call truth is shaped by the needs of society, by its desire to define, control, and normalize. The mad, then, were not simply discovered, they were created as a category, and their exclusion served a social purpose. For readers in the 1960s, this was a shocking perspective. Europe was still marked by the legacy of asylums, by the memory of institutions where the mentally ill had been locked away for life. In France, asylums still held thousands, often in grim conditions. Foucault's book struck a nerve because it suggested that this was not a tragic leftover from a less enlightened past. It was part of the very fabric of modern society. It is worth pausing to see how this connects to our own time. Today, debates about mental health are everywhere. We speak more openly about depression, anxiety, and trauma. But at the same time, categories like normal and abnormal still shape lives. Consider how diagnoses affect whether someone is employable, insurable, or even trusted. Think about how schools and workplaces label certain behaviors as disorders, often with real consequences for those labeled. Foucault's point still resonates. Madness is not just a condition of the brain, it is a social boundary, enforced by institutions and categories. What made Madness and Civilization more than history was Foucault's style. The book is vivid, even poetic at times. He describes the ship of fools, a legendary vessel said, to carry the insane away from the city, drifting on rivers as a floating symbol of exclusion. He evokes the silence imposed on the mad, the way their voices were removed from the conversation of reason. For Foucault, this silence was not just metaphorical, it was real, imposed by institutions that refused to hear them. And yet, despite its brilliance, the book was controversial. Historians accused Foucault of exaggeration, of bending the facts to fit his thesis. Psychiatrists bristled at his critique, insisting that their field was about healing, not exclusion. Even sympathetic readers wondered if he was too harsh, too cynical about medicine. Foucault welcomed these debates. For him, controversy was not failure. It was proof that he had struck a nerve. Looking back, Madness and Civilization marked the beginning of Foucault's lifelong project to show how knowledge and power intertwine. Whether in medicine, prisons, or sexuality, he would return to the same basic insight, that categories of truth are never neutral, that they serve to shape and control people's lives. The mad, in this first work, were the first figures in his genealogy of exclusion. Later would come the criminal, the deviant, the homosexual, but the method was the same, to reveal the hidden politics beneath what we take for granted as truth. For Foucault personally, the book was also a liberation. It allowed him to transform his own experiences of alienation and psychiatric treatment into a larger analysis. He had taken his pain and made it a lens for understanding society. This was not therapy, it was philosophy, sharpened by suffering. And in doing so, he gave voice to those who had been silenced for centuries. As the 1960s unfolded, Foucault's work would take him far from the asylum and into new arenas, the prison, the hospital, the school. Each would reveal new dimensions of how societies discipline and control. But it all began with madness, with the realization that what counts as rational or normal is not a timeless truth, but a historical decision, one with consequences for those who find themselves on the wrong side of the line. By the mid-1960s, Foucault's reputation was growing. Madness and Civilization had made him a provocative figure, and he was teaching, researching, and publishing steadily. But his next move would puzzle even some of his admirers. Instead of continuing with a historical study of prisons or sexuality topics that might have seemed natural extensions of his first work, he turned inward to method itself. The result was The Archaeology of Knowledge, 1969, a dense, often challenging book that forced readers to rethink how knowledge is constructed. To appreciate why this mattered, we need to understand what Foucault was trying to do. In Madness and Civilization, he had already suggested that categories like madness were not timeless truths, but products of history. Yet some critics asked, how exactly do we study such shifts? How do we analyze the conditions under which knowledge itself becomes possible? The Archaeology of Knowledge was Foucault's attempt to answer that question. The word archaeology is important here. Normally, we think of archaeology as digging through layers of earth to uncover traces of the past. Foucault used the metaphor for knowledge. He proposed that beneath the surface of our ideas lie deeper structures, rules of discourse, systems of thought, that determine what can be said, what counts as true, and what gets excluded. We do not simply discover knowledge, we inherit frameworks that make some ideas visible and others unthinkable. Take an example. In the 18th century, doctors began speaking about disease in terms of lesions in the body, observable through autopsies. Before that, disease was understood as an imbalance of humors. What changed was not only medical discovery, but the very framework through which doctors looked at bodies. A new episteme, Foucault's term for these underlying structures of knowledge, made it possible to see disease differently. Once that shift happened, older ways of speaking about illness became obsolete, even incomprehensible. This is what Foucault meant by archaeology, uncovering the rules that govern knowledge at a given moment in history. Importantly, these rules are not conscious, no one votes on them. They are not decreed by kings or parliaments. They emerge in subtle, distributed ways across texts, practices, and institutions. And once established, they define the horizon of thought. To use a modern analogy, imagine the operating system on a computer. You might install apps, write documents, browse the internet. But the operating system itself quietly shapes what is possible. For Foucault, epistemes were like the hidden operating systems of culture. This was a radical claim because it meant that what we call truth is historically contingent. Truth does not emerge simply because someone discovers it. It becomes possible only when society has the framework to recognize it as truth. Before germ theory, microbes were invisible not just physically, but conceptually. People literally could not think them. It took a shift in discourse, a reorganization of knowledge, to make microbes a meaningful reality. Now, you might wonder, isn't this just history of science? In one sense, yes. But Foucault went further. He applied the same lens, not just to medicine or biology, but to all fields of knowledge, linguistics, economics, psychology. He wanted to show that behind every discipline lies a silent architecture of thought that makes it possible. This is why he called his method archaeology. He was digging beneath the surface of ideas to reveal the foundations beneath. For readers, the archaeology of knowledge was difficult. It lacked the dramatic imagery of madness and civilization. There were no ships of fools or vivid scenes of confinement. Instead, it was systematic, even abstract. Some complained it was unreadable, but others saw in it a powerful tool, a way of analyzing the hidden assumptions that shape what we believe to be true. It is worth considering how this applies to our own lives. Think about debates today around gender, identity, or health. The very possibility of saying certain things, that gender is fluid, for example, or that mental illness is a matter of brain chemistry, depends on the frameworks available to us. 50 years ago, some of these claims would have been unthinkable. 50 years from now, other truths may emerge that we cannot currently imagine. Foucault's point is that truth is not timeless. It is structured by the epistemes of its age. This can sound destabilizing. If truth is contingent, does that mean nothing is real? Foucault resisted that interpretation. He did not say reality is an illusion, germs exist, bodies exist, madness exists. But the way we understand them, the way we make them part of knowledge, is always mediated by discourse and power. To say that madness is caused by spirits, or by humors, or by chemical imbalances, are not neutral descriptions. They are products of historical frameworks, and those frameworks have consequences, determining who is locked up, who is treated, who is ignored. By developing archaeology, Foucault armed himself with a method he would use in all his later works. He would dig into the layers of discourse to reveal how institutions, whether hospitals, prisons, or schools, structured knowledge and enforced categories of normality. The book may not have been his most popular, but it laid the groundwork for everything that followed. And there is one more aspect worth noting. By shifting focus to the structures beneath ideas, Foucault also undermined the role of the individual author. If knowledge is shaped by frameworks larger than any single person, then philosophers, scientists, and writers are not heroic discoverers of truth. They are participants in discourses that exceed them. Later, in his famous essay, What is an Author?, Foucault would argue that the author is a function of discourse, not its origin. Already in The Archaeology of Knowledge, we see the seeds of this critique. For today's listener, this is a humbling thought. When you scroll through news feeds, when you argue about politics, when you trust or distrust science, you are not simply accessing neutral truths. You are operating within discourses shaped by history, by institutions, by power. You think freely, yes, but you also think within frameworks that define what freedom itself can mean. Foucault's archaeology, then, is not a dusty academic exercise. It is a call to awareness. To ask, what are the hidden rules that shape the truths of our time? And what might we see differently if those rules were to change? After completing his early studies and producing his first works, Michel Foucault did something that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. He left France. While others stayed close to Parisian intellectual life, Foucault took academic posts abroad, teaching and researching in Sweden, Poland, and Tunisia during the 1950s and 1960s. These years away from home were not just professional detours. They were crucial in shaping his perspective, broadening his sense of culture, and exposing him to political realities that would sharpen his radicalism. His first destination was Uppsala, Sweden, in 1955. At the time, Sweden seemed almost another world compared to France. Uppsala University was respected, but the intellectual climate was less heated, less bound by the traditions of Parisian philosophy. Here, Foucault had the space to continue developing what would become madness and civilization. The Swedish archives gave him access to medical and psychiatric records that enriched his historical research. But Sweden was also a place of personal discovery. Away from the pressures of his family and the gossip of Paris, Foucault could explore his sexuality with more freedom. Though still constrained by social norms, Sweden was less repressive than France. He immersed himself in new relationships, new experiences. For someone who often felt watched and judged, Uppsala offered a sense of distance, a chance to reinvent himself. It was also in Sweden that he began to build a persona that combined rigorous scholarship with a flair for provocation. He was not content simply to write history, he wanted to disrupt it, to challenge assumptions. From Sweden, Foucault moved to Poland in 1958, taking a post at the French Cultural Center in Warsaw. This was a striking choice, because Poland at the time was under communist rule. The Iron Curtain had descended across Eastern Europe, and Warsaw was a city shaped by both Soviet influence and Polish resistance. For a French intellectual, this was not an easy environment. The government monitored foreign academics, and political dissent was dangerous. Yet Foucault found the atmosphere stimulating. He encountered Eastern European intellectuals who lived with censorship, who debated philosophy and politics under constant scrutiny. He saw firsthand how ideology shaped daily life. In Warsaw, Marxism was not a distant theory debated in cafes. It was a lived reality, imposed by the state, sometimes brutally. This experience sharpened Foucault's suspicion of grand narratives of liberation. He saw how systems claiming to serve the people could just as easily become instruments of control. His time in Poland, however, ended abruptly. Foucault became involved in a homosexual relationship, which was discovered by the authorities. Under pressure and facing scandal, he was forced to leave Warsaw. This episode underscored the risks he carried with him as an openly gay man, especially in hostile political climates. But it also deepened his sense of solidarity with those marginalized by institutions. He had seen, once again, how power operates at the intersection of politics and personal life, how regimes regulate not just speech, but bodies, desires, and relationships. From Poland, Foucault moved to Tunisia in 1966, where he taught philosophy at the University of Tunis. Tunisia, newly independent from French colonial rule, was in a period of transformation. The air was charged with debates about national identity, modernization, and the legacy of colonialism. For Foucault, it was a fascinating environment, one that exposed him to the complexities of post-colonial societies. It was also in Tunisia that Foucault became more directly engaged with political activism. His students were involved in protests against government repression, and he supported them, sometimes at personal risk. The experience radicalized him further. He began to see philosophy not just as analysis, but as intervention. Watching students face censorship and imprisonment for demanding freedom left a lasting mark on him. At the same time, Tunisia gave Foucault new perspective on the Eurocentrism of much Western philosophy. He was confronted with questions of culture, tradition, and difference in ways that challenged the assumptions of French intellectual life. For someone already skeptical of universal truths, Tunisia reinforced the lesson that knowledge is always situated, always shaped by context. Looking back, these years abroad were crucial in making Foucault the thinker he became. Sweden gave him distance and archives, a space to refine his early work. Poland exposed him to the lived realities of ideology and repression. Tunisia immersed him in post-colonial struggles and radical student politics. Each experience widened his horizon, making him less of a French philosopher and more of a global intellectual. They also revealed a pattern in his life. Foucault was always drawn to the margins. He sought out environments where ideas clashed, where power was visible, where institutions pressed upon people's lives. He was not content to remain in Parisian salons debating abstractions. He wanted to see how philosophy lived in prisons, in asylums, in communist states, in post-colonial societies. His thought grew not from retreat, but from immersion. For today's audience, there is a lesson here. Philosophy is often imagined as something remote, detached, perhaps even elitist. But Foucault reminds us that philosophy can and must be worldly. It emerges from encounters with difference, from facing regimes of power, from listening to those who resist. His years abroad show how stepping outside familiar environments can transform thought, making it more responsive, more alive. When Foucault returned to France after these years, he was no longer just a brilliant scholar. He was a man who had seen repression firsthand, who had felt the weight of institutions on his own body, who had witnessed the struggles of students and dissidents. He came back with a sharpened sense of urgency, ready to confront French society with new critiques. And soon, history would give him the chance. Because, in 1968, Paris itself would erupt in revolt. In the spring of 1968, Paris exploded. What began as a series of student protests at universities quickly spread into one of the largest uprisings in modern French history. Workers went on strike. Millions poured into the streets. The government of Charles de Gaulle trembled. For weeks, it seemed as if France itself was on the verge of revolution. And in the middle of it all was Michel Foucault, newly returned from Tunisia, a philosopher whose thinking about power and resistance was about to meet reality in the most dramatic way possible. The roots of the revolt lay in frustration. Students were fed up with outdated universities, rigid authority, and a system that treated them as numbers rather than voices. Workers resented low wages, poor conditions, and the alienation of industrial labor. Intellectuals denounced capitalism, imperialism, and the remnants of colonialism. France in the late 1960s was a nation of contradictions, proud of its culture, but divided by inequality, boasting of freedom, but burdened with hierarchies. When the spark of protest lit, the fire spread rapidly. The streets of Paris were filled with graffiti that read, "It is forbidden to forbid," and "Be realistic, demand the impossible." These slogans captured something Foucault already believed. That power is not only in governments and laws, but in the everyday norms that tell us what is possible, what is thinkable, what is allowed. Unlike Sartre, who threw himself directly into the protests, standing on barricades and addressing students, Foucault's role was more complex. He supported the movement, but he was also critical. He admired the revolt's energy, its refusal of authority, but he distrusted grand revolutionary rhetoric. He had seen in Poland how revolutions claiming to liberate people could turn into new forms of repression. He was wary of ideology, even when it wore the mask of freedom. Still, the events of May 1968 changed him. They convinced him that philosophy could not remain in classrooms. It had to engage with the struggles of its time. He began to think more concretely about institutions, not just abstractly about discourse, but about how power operated in prisons, hospitals, schools, and workplaces. The revolt had exposed the fragility of authority. Now he wanted to know how it held together the rest of the time. For Foucault personally, the revolt was also a turning point in his career. In its aftermath, French universities were transformed. Old hierarchies were questioned. New intellectual currents gained momentum. Foucault found himself increasingly at the center of debates about power, knowledge, and society. He was appointed to new academic positions, including at the experimental University of Vincennes, where radical teaching was encouraged. There, he encountered younger students and activists who challenged him as much as he challenged them. What struck him most about 1968 was not simply the scale of the protests, but the way they revealed the microphysics of power, a term he would later use to describe how authority works at every level of society. In the streets, he saw students rejecting not just government policies, but the very structures of discipline that shaped their lives, classrooms arranged like prisons, exams that measured conformity, rules that demanded obedience. The revolt was not just against the state, it was against the everyday machinery of normalization. It is here that we can see the seeds of some of Foucault's most important works. Discipline and Punish, written later in the 1970s, was in many ways a response to the lessons of 1968. In it, he analyzed how modern societies discipline individuals, not only through laws, but through schools, factories, hospitals, and prisons. The barricades of Paris had shown him that resistance was possible, but also that power was more pervasive than most realized. For listeners today, May 1968 might feel distant. But think about the global protests we have witnessed in recent years, movements sparked by inequality, injustice, or state repression. Think about the way students, workers, and marginalized groups continue to challenge authority, from climate strikes to demands for racial justice. The slogans may change, but the energy of 1968 still reverberates. And Foucault's insights into power and resistance remain strikingly relevant. Authority is never absolute, but it is also never absent. It shapes us even when we don't notice. Foucault himself later reflected on 1968 with ambivalence. He admired the courage of the protesters, but he resisted romanticizing the event. He believed revolts reveal cracks in the system, but he cautioned that systems adapt. Power shifts, reorganizes, finds new ways to assert itself. True resistance, he thought, must be ongoing, not just a burst of passion. It must constantly question the rules that govern life. Still, there is no doubt that May 1968 left a mark on him. It connected his philosophy to lived struggle. It turned his gaze more sharply toward institutions and everyday forms of power. And it deepened his conviction that freedom is never given. It must always be fought for, not only against governments, but against the subtle norms that define what is possible. When the smoke cleared and de Gaulle's government regained control, France returned to a kind of uneasy normality. But for Foucault, nothing would ever be the same. The revolts had shown him the raw energy of resistance and the resilience of authority. His task now was to map the terrain more carefully, to uncover how power operates in detail, how it shapes bodies, minds, and institutions. And his next object of study would be one of the most hidden and disturbing of those institutions, the prison. In 1975, Michel Foucault published what would become one of his most famous and unsettling works, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. If madness and civilization had unmasked the asylum, Discipline and Punish did the same for prisons. But more than that, it redefined how we think about punishment, authority, and control in the modern world. The book begins with a scene so shocking that it is hard to forget. Foucault describes the 1757 public execution of Robert François Damiens, who had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. Damiens was tortured in the town square, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his body pulled apart by horses, his remains burned. It was a spectacle of sovereign power, brutal, bloody, and meant to terrify. But then Foucault contrasts this with the prison timetable from a century later. The schedule lists when prisoners must wake, work, eat, pray, and sleep. It is not bloody, it is not spectacular, yet Foucault insists it is no less a form of punishment, just a different kind. Instead of breaking the body in public, the modern system disciplines the individual in private. It trains, molds, and regulates. Power has shifted from spectacle to discipline. This is the central argument of Discipline and Punish, that modern societies do not abandon punishment, but transform it. We no longer execute criminals in public squares. Instead, we confine them in prisons. But the prison is not merely a humanitarian improvement. It represents a new logic of power, one that aims not just to punish, but to discipline. To explain this, Foucault introduces one of his most famous images, the panopticon. Designed by the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, the panopticon was a circular prison in which a single guard tower could observe all prisoners, who themselves could never know whether they were being watched. In practice, it was almost impossible to monitor everyone at once. But that was the point. Because prisoners could never be sure, they began to police themselves. For Foucault, the panopticon was more than a prison design. It was a metaphor for modern power. In schools, factories, hospitals, and offices, he argued, people are constantly observed, tested, and regulated. Whether through grades, medical exams, employee evaluations, or surveillance cameras, individuals learn to monitor their own behavior. We become, in his words, docile bodies, trained not only to obey, but to internalize obedience. This insight was and remains deeply unsettling. It suggests that modern society is not freer than the age of kings, but differently controlled. Instead of power being concentrated in a sovereign who punishes with spectacle, it becomes diffuse, embedded in institutions and routines. Discipline seeps into everyday life, shaping how we move, speak, work, and even think. When Discipline and Punish was published, it caused a sensation. Some readers found it electrifying, others found it terrifying. Critics accused Foucault of exaggeration, of painting modern institutions as sinister machines. Supporters hailed him for revealing what had been hidden in plain sight. Either way, the book changed the way people thought about prisons and beyond. It is important to note that Foucault did not write in the abstract. In the years leading up to the book, he had become involved with prison reform movements in France. He listened to prisoners, activists, and families. He spoke out against the inhumane conditions in French prisons, where overcrowding, neglect, and brutality were rampant. Discipline and Punish was not just theory, it was an intervention rooted in real struggles. And it had broader implications. If prisons embody discipline, then so do schools, hospitals, and workplaces. Consider, for example, how schools regiment time, measure performance, and reward conformity. Or how workplaces evaluate employees with performance reviews and surveillance software. Or how hospitals monitor patients, chart their progress, and classify them by categories. All of these, Foucault argued, are part of the same disciplinary logic. This is where the book connects so powerfully with our present. In the age of digital surveillance, the panopticon feels more relevant than ever. Social media, smartphones, and biometric tracking create systems where people never know when they are being observed. Employers monitor emails. Governments collect data. Algorithms analyze behavior. And like the prisoners in Bentham's design, we adjust ourselves accordingly, often without realizing it. Foucault's metaphor, written in the 1970s, has become a haunting description of 21st century life. But Discipline and Punish is not merely a warning, it also opens a space for resistance. If power works not only through law, but through discipline, then resistance must also operate at the level of daily life. It is not enough to demand political reform. One must question the subtle ways in which we are trained to think and behave. This is why Foucault insisted that power and resistance are inseparable. Wherever there is discipline, there is also the possibility of refusal. The brilliance of the book lies in its scope. It begins with torture and ends with schools. It connects the scaffold to the classroom, the prison cell to the hospital ward. It shows that punishment is not confined to criminals, but woven into the fabric of modern life. In doing so, it challenges us to rethink what it means to be free. For Foucault, freedom is not the absence of power. Power is everywhere, and it shapes us in ways we cannot escape. But freedom is the ability to recognize these structures, to question them, to push against them. Discipline and Punish is not a declaration of despair. It is a map of how power works, so that we can see where resistance might emerge. Looking back, the book marks a turning point in Foucault's career. With it, he moved from the history of ideas to the analysis of institutions. He gave philosophy a new vocabulary, discipline, surveillance, panopticism, that continues to resonate across fields from sociology to political science to cultural studies. It is no exaggeration to say that Discipline and Punish transformed the intellectual landscape. And yet, Foucault was not finished. Having unmasked the asylum and the prison, he turned to something even more intimate, sexuality itself. By the mid-1970s, Michel Foucault was at the height of his influence. He had reshaped debates about madness, knowledge, and prisons. But now he turned to a subject even more intimate and more controversial, sexuality. In 1976, he published the first volume of what would become his most ambitious project, The History of Sexuality. It was a work that challenged common sense, unsettled assumptions, and forever changed how we think about desire, identity, and power. At the time, the dominant story about sexuality was one of repression. Many believed that Western society, particularly from the Victorian era onward, had silenced sex. The story went like this. People once spoke freely about desire, but with the rise of modern morality, sexuality was driven underground, spoken of only in whispers, confined to the private sphere. Freud, it was said, broke this silence by daring to talk about sexuality openly. The sexual revolution of the 1960s was celebrated as a liberation from centuries of repression. Foucault turned this narrative upside down. In The History of Sexuality, he argued that, far from repressing sex, modern societies had in fact produced endless discourses about it. Beginning in the 17th century, doctors, priests, teachers, and bureaucrats did not stop talking about sex. they multiplied ways of speaking about it. Confession, medical examination, moral instruction, and scientific categorization all turned sexuality into a subject of intense scrutiny. Instead of being silenced, sex became an object of knowledge. This was Foucault's paradox. The more society claimed to repress sex, the more it actually talked about it. Power did not silence desire, it incited discourse. Sexuality was not a natural truth, waiting to be liberated. It was constructed through these discourses. Consider the example of childhood sexuality. In the 19th century, educators, doctors, and parents became obsessed with the dangers of masturbation. Manuals, lectures, and treatises warned against it, prescribing vigilance and discipline. In theory, the goal was to repress sexual expression. In practice, this produced an entire network of surveillance and conversation around children's bodies. In trying to repress sexuality, society made it hyper-visible. The same was true of homosexuality. In medieval times, sodomy was condemned as a sinful act, but it was not tied to identity. In the 19th century, however, homosexuality was transformed from an act into a category of personhood. Medical and legal discourses began to define the homosexual as a type of individual, someone with a specific nature, psychology, and destiny. Foucault himself, as a gay man, was acutely aware of this. He understood that his own identity had been shaped not by silence, but by a flood of discourse that categorized and defined him. This was the central argument of the history of sexuality. Sexuality is not a natural essence. It is a social construct, produced through the interplay of knowledge and power. We do not simply discover our desires, we learn to experience them through the categories society provides. What made this argument powerful was Foucault's concept of biopower. In earlier eras, power was about sovereignty, the right of kings to take life. In the modern age, Foucault argued, power takes a new form, the regulation of life itself. Governments, doctors, and institutions do not merely command or punish, they manage populations. They track birth rates, control fertility, monitor health, regulate sexuality. This is biopower, power exercised not by killing, but by fostering life, by shaping the biological existence of people. For listeners today, the relevance is obvious. Consider debates over reproductive rights, sexual education, gender identity, or public health. These are not just personal matters. They are shaped by policies, institutions, and discourses that define what kinds of life are valued, what kinds of desire are legitimate, and what kinds of bodies are regulated. Foucault's claim that sexuality is a site of power remains as provocative as ever. But the history of sexuality was not a book of despair. Foucault also emphasized that wherever power operates, there is resistance. By recognizing that sexuality is constructed, we can also see that it is not fixed. New identities, new forms of desire, new possibilities of freedom can emerge. This insight became crucial for later movements: feminism, queer theory, LGBTQ+ activism, all of which drew on Foucault's work to challenge norms and expand freedom. The first volume of The History of Sexuality set the stage for a series, but Foucault's plans shifted. Originally, he intended to write multiple volumes on topics like confession, science, and population. But he changed course, devoting later volumes to the history of ancient sexuality, how the Greeks and Romans thought about desire, the self, and ethics. He believed these histories could shed light on alternative ways of living, beyond the modern categories of identity. Even so, the first volume remains the most influential. Its thesis that sexuality is not silenced but produced, not natural but constructed, has become a cornerstone of modern thought. It challenged not only Victorian morality, but also liberationist narratives that assumed we could simply return to a more natural truth. Foucault insisted there is no natural truth of sex waiting to be uncovered. There are only discourses, practices, and possibilities. For those who read it in the 1970s, the book was both unsettling and liberating. It suggested that liberation is not about uncovering an authentic sexuality, but about questioning the categories that define it. It shifted the conversation from morality to power, from essence to construction. And it opened a new field of inquiry that continues to shape debates today. Looking back, the history of sexuality marked a culmination of Foucault's project. From madness to prisons to sex, He showed how power and knowledge intertwine to shape human life. And in doing so, he gave us a new way to understand ourselves, not as fixed essences, but as beings shaped by history, discourse, and resistance. If Discipline and Punish revealed how modern institutions shape individuals, and the history of sexuality expose how discourse constructs desire, then Foucault's concept of biopolitics brought these insights to their widest scale. It was here that he turned from individuals to populations, from the prison cell to society at large. And in doing so, he gave us one of the most powerful tools for understanding modern governance. A tool that feels startlingly relevant in our own age of pandemics, digital surveillance, and debates over health and freedom. Foucault first introduced the idea of biopower in The History of Sexuality, 1976. He described it as a new form of power that emerged in the modern era, distinct from the sovereign power of kings. In earlier centuries, power was the right to take life, the king's authority to punish, to wage war, to execute. But modern states, Foucault argued, exercise power in a different way. They do not simply take life, they administer it. They monitor birth rates, regulate health, encourage productivity, and manage sexuality. They work not only through repression, but through the optimization of life. This shift gave rise to what Foucault called biopolitics, the politics of life itself. Governments began to see populations not just as subjects, but as living beings to be managed, measured, and organized. Statistics, demographics, public health campaigns, and social policies became tools of governance. In this sense, modern politics is less about spectacular acts of authority and more about the subtle regulation of bodies and populations. To make this concrete, consider the rise of vaccination programs. In the 19th century, governments promoted vaccines not merely as medical advances, but as matters of national interest. Healthy citizens meant a stronger workforce, more soldiers, and less social unrest. Public health, then, was not only about curing individuals, but about securing the vitality of the population as a whole. This is biopolitics in action, the fusion of medicine, governance, and social control. But biopolitics is not only about health. It extends to sexuality, reproduction, housing, education, and labor. Policies around family planning, welfare, or immigration are all examples of how states regulate life. Even when governments appear to promote freedom, say through encouraging healthy lifestyles, they are simultaneously shaping behavior, guiding choices, and managing risks. For Foucault, this meant that modern power is both more humane and more insidious than older forms. It does not rule by the sword alone, but by nurturing life, guiding conduct, and encouraging self-regulation. Yet precisely because it is less visible, it is harder to resist. Unlike the scaffold or the dungeon, biopolitical power often feels natural, even benevolent. Who could object to health, safety, or productivity? And yet, beneath these aims lies a form of control that reaches into the most intimate dimensions of existence. This is where Foucault's insights strike so close to our own time. In the age of COVID-19, governments across the world implemented measures, lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine requirements, that directly regulated daily life in the name of protecting populations. Some saw this as necessary, others as overreach. Foucault would not have taken a simple side. He would have pointed out that these debates are precisely about biopolitics. How far should states go in governing life, and how do we balance health with freedom? Another contemporary example is digital surveillance. Today, vast amounts of data are collected about our movements, habits, and even biological states. Fitness trackers monitor heart rates and sleep patterns. Social media platforms analyze behavior to target ads. Governments use biometric databases to track citizens. These practices are not primarily about punishment. They are about optimization, efficiency, and prediction. But in shaping how we live and what choices we make, they exemplify the logic of biopolitics. Importantly, Foucault emphasized that biopolitics is not a conspiracy. It is not a shadowy cabal pulling strings. Rather, it is a diffuse system that emerges from institutions, policies, and practices. Doctors, teachers, bureaucrats, and scientists all play roles, often with good intentions. The danger lies not in malice, but in the quiet normalization of control. Yet, as always for Foucault, power is never absolute. Where there is biopolitics, there is also resistance. Individuals and groups push back, redefine categories, demand autonomy. Feminist movements challenge state control over reproduction. LGBTQ+ activists resisted the medical pathologization of sexuality. Patients' rights groups questioned the authority of doctors. In each case, new forms of life and identity emerged, showing that biopolitics is never complete. For today's listener, the concept of biopolitics offers a lens to understand controversies that otherwise seem confusing. Why do debates about healthcare, reproductive rights, or pandemics feel so charged? Why do arguments about personal freedom so often intersect with issues of health and biology? Foucault's answer is that in the modern world, life itself is political. Bodies are not just personal, they are governed, regulated, and contested. The history of sexuality was only the beginning of Foucault's exploration of biopolitics. In his later lectures at the Collège de France, he developed the concept further, linking it to neoliberalism, governmentality, and the ways in which individuals govern themselves. But already in the mid-1970s, he had laid the foundation. Biopolitics was not just a new idea, it was a new way of seeing how power works in the modern age. And it is this idea, perhaps more than any other, that makes Foucault a philosopher for our time. When we argue about masks, vaccines, surveillance, or reproductive rights, we are living in the terrain he mapped out decades ago. He showed us that these are not just medical or moral issues, they are political struggles over life itself. From here, Foucault's thought would take yet another turn. Having explored madness, prisons, sexuality, and biopolitics, he began to focus on how individuals relate to themselves. If power governs life, how do we govern ourselves? And in answering that question, he turned to the ancient world. By the late 1970s, Michel Foucault was already recognized as one of France's most provocative thinkers. He had unmasked the hidden operations of power in asylums, prisons, and sexual discourse. Yet, instead of continuing forward into modernity, Foucault did something unexpected. He turned backward into the world of the ancients. His focus shifted to Greek and Roman sexuality, to how classical civilizations understood desire, ethics, and the self. The result was the later volumes of The History of Sexuality works that startled readers by moving away from institutions of discipline toward what he called the care of the self. Why this turn to antiquity? Some critics thought Foucault had abandoned politics in favor of dusty classics, but he insisted that the move was consistent with his broader project. If he had shown how modern sexuality was constructed by discourse, he now wanted to ask, were there alternative ways of living, thinking, and experiencing desire? By studying the ancients, Foucault hoped to uncover other possibilities, other modes of subjectivity, that might challenge the modern assumption that sexuality is a deep truth of who we are. In the second and third volumes of The History of Sexuality, The Use of Pleasure and the Care of the Self, both published in 1984, Foucault explored how the Greeks and Romans approached desire. He found that, unlike the modern West, they did not treat sexuality as a hidden essence of identity. Instead, they saw it as part of a larger ethical practice, tied to self-mastery, balance, and aesthetics of living. Take the Greeks, for example. In their ethics, sex was not repressed, but it was regulated by ideals of moderation. Excess was seen as dangerous, not because it was immoral in itself, but because it could lead to imbalance, loss of self-control, or social disharmony. Sexuality was one aspect of a broader art of living, a matter of cultivating virtue, health, and harmony with the self and others. The Romans developed this further with practices of self-examination, reflection, and confession. They engaged in what Foucault called technologies of the self methods of writing, meditation, and discipline designed to shape character. For them, sexuality was less about discovering a hidden truth than about exercising control, crafting an ethical life, and caring for the soul. What fascinated Foucault was that, in these ancient practices, sexuality was not tied to identity. There was no notion of a person being defined as heterosexual or homosexual. Acts might be judged according to roles, excess, or social expectations, but they did not define the individual's essence. This stood in sharp contrast to modern society, where sexuality had become a defining marker of identity, classified and scrutinized by medicine, psychology, and law. In turning to antiquity, Foucault was not nostalgic. He did not suggest we should return to Greek or Roman morality. Instead, he saw these histories as ways of denaturalizing our own categories. If the ancients could live without defining people by sexuality, then our way of thinking was not inevitable. It was historical, contingent, and therefore open to change. This was also a deeply personal project. As a gay man living in a time when homosexuality was pathologized, policed, and politicized, Foucault sought alternatives to the medicalized categories that had defined him. Ancient sexuality provided a vision of desire unbound from identity, where ethics was about practice rather than essence. For someone who had spent his career showing how institutions construct truth, the ancients offered a glimpse of other truths, ones that could inspire new forms of freedom. The theme that emerged most strongly in these later works was the care of the self. For the ancients, caring for oneself was not selfishness, it was the foundation of ethics. It meant cultivating the body, mind, and spirit through practices of diet, exercise, reflection, and moderation. It meant crafting one's life as a work of art. For Foucault, this idea was revolutionary. It suggested that freedom was not just about resisting institutions, but about shaping oneself in creative, ethical ways. This emphasis on self-care resonates deeply today. In an age of burnout, surveillance, and endless productivity, the notion that ethics could mean caring for oneself feels both radical and necessary. But Foucault's concept goes far beyond wellness trends. It is not about spa days or self-indulgence. It is about asking, how do we govern ourselves? How do we live meaningfully in relation to others while resisting the forces that seek to define us? Some critics were baffled by this late turn in Foucault's thought. Was he abandoning politics? Was he retreating into personal ethics? He rejected that interpretation. For him, the care of the self was inseparable from politics, because the way we shape ourselves is deeply tied to the way societies govern. To cultivate alternative practices of selfhood is to resist the dominant forms of control. Ethics and politics, in this sense, were two sides of the same coin. His lectures at the Collège de France during these years developed these themes further, linking self-care to the broader notion of governmentality, the ways in which individuals and institutions govern conduct. The care of the self, he argued, could serve as a counterpoint to biopolitical control, opening spaces for autonomy and creativity. Tragically, these works were published only months before Foucault's death in 1984. They represent his final statement, his last attempt to reimagine freedom. For a thinker often accused of cynicism, the turn to self-care was almost hopeful. It suggested that even in a world saturated with power, there remains a possibility for transformation, for living differently. For listeners today, Foucault's late works challenge us to think beyond identity, beyond fixed truths, beyond resignation to control. They invite us to treat life as a project, to cultivate ourselves deliberately, to care for the body, the mind, and the relationships that sustain us. They remind us that freedom is not given. It is practiced, day by day, through acts of self-formation. Having explored madness, prisons, sexuality, and biopolitics, Foucault closed his career by returning to the most intimate level, the self. And in doing so, he left us with one of his most enduring questions: how might we live differently? One of the challenges in approaching Michel Foucault is that he was not simply a philosopher of ideas, but also a philosopher of method. He did not just make claims about madness, prisons, or sexuality. He invented ways of studying them. Two of his most important methodological contributions were what he called archaeology and genealogy. Understanding the difference between these approaches is crucial, because it explains how his thought developed across his career and why his works sometimes look so different in tone and focus. We encountered archaeology already in The Archaeology of Knowledge. This was Foucault's attempt to describe the hidden structures of discourse that determine what can be said and thought at any given time. Archaeology is about excavating layers of thought, uncovering the epistemes, the underlying frameworks of knowledge that shape our understanding of the world. Think of archaeology as a map of possibilities. It tells us what kinds of statements are allowed in a given era. what counts as legitimate knowledge, what gets excluded. It is less about individuals and more about the system as a whole. When Foucault studies medicine in The Birth of the Clinic, for example, he is not interested in heroic doctors making discoveries. He is interested in how the very language of medicine shifted, from humors to lesions, from symptoms to pathology, because a new discursive framework emerged. But archaeology has its limits. It can describe structures, but it struggles to explain how they change. It shows us the what of discourse, but not always the why. This is where genealogy enters. Genealogy, a term Foucault borrowed from Nietzsche, is a method for tracing the history of concepts, practices, and institutions in a way that highlights their contingency and conflict. Instead of assuming that ideas progress naturally toward truth, genealogy shows how they emerge from struggles, accidents, and power relations. It unmasks what seems natural by revealing its messy history. Take the example of punishment. A traditional history might say, societies used to torture criminals, but gradually they became more humane and developed prisons. A genealogical account, like the one Foucault gives in Discipline and Punish, disrupts this narrative. It shows that the shift from torture to prisons was not just progress. It was a transformation in the logic of power, from sovereignty to discipline. The prison was not a humanitarian improvement, but a new form of control. Genealogy is therefore more dynamic than archaeology. It looks at practices, institutions, and conflicts. It asks, who benefited from this change? What struggles shaped it? What exclusions were enforced? Whereas archaeology reveals the rules of discourse, genealogy reveals the power relations that sustain them. They complement one another. Archaeology shows the structures, genealogy shows the forces and struggles that move them. Together, they allow Foucault to analyze both the stability and the change in systems of knowledge and power. For example, when he studied sexuality, archaeology helped him describe the discourses, medical, legal, religious, that defined what could be said about desire. Genealogy, meanwhile, helped him trace how these discourses emerged from conflicts, such as the Church's struggle to regulate confession, or the state's need to manage populations. Without archaeology, we would miss the structures. Without genealogy, we would miss the politics. It is worth noting that genealogy also reveals Foucault's debt to Nietzsche. Like Nietzsche, he rejected the idea of timeless truths. He insisted that values, norms, and knowledge are historically produced, often through violence, exclusion, or domination. Genealogy is a way of showing how fragile our categories are, how what we take to be natural is really contingent. In this sense, genealogy is also a tool of critique. By exposing the constructed nature of our truths, it opens the possibility of thinking differently. For readers today, these methods are not just academic exercises. They offer tools for analyzing the world around us. Imagine applying archaeology to social media. What are the underlying discourses that make certain statements possible, that define what counts as credible or legitimate online? And then apply genealogy. How did these practices emerge? What struggles over speech, censorship, and power shaped them? Suddenly, we see that even something as ordinary as a Twitter feed is structured by deep historical forces. Foucault's methodological innovations also explain why his works feel so varied. Madness and Civilization is archaeological, mapping how madness is constructed in discourse. Discipline and Punish is genealogical, tracing the history of punishment as a shift in power relations. The history of sexuality combines both, showing discursive structures and their political genealogies. To read Foucault is to move between excavation and storytelling, between system and struggle. This methodological pluralism is one reason Foucault resists simple categorization. He was not a Marxist, though he analyzed power and exploitation. He was not a structuralist, though he studied structures of discourse. He was not an existentialist, though he cared about freedom. Instead, he borrowed what he needed and invented the rest. His work is less a doctrine than a toolbox. Archaeology and genealogy are two of its most versatile tools. There is also something profoundly liberating in these methods. By showing that our truths have histories, Foucault undermines fatalism. If categories like madness, crime, or sexuality were produced by history, then they can also be transformed. The genealogical method, in particular, insists that nothing is inevitable. Things could have been otherwise, and they still can be. For listeners trying to make sense of today's world, that is an empowering message. When we confront debates about gender, race, health, or freedom, Foucault's methods remind us that the categories at play are not eternal. They are products of history, and by revealing that history, we open the possibility of change. In the end, archaeology and genealogy are not just methods of research, they are acts of resistance. They expose the seams of history, the cracks in what appears solid. They show us that our world is made, and that anything made can be remade. If there is one phrase most often associated with Michel Foucault, it is this: power knowledge. Not power and knowledge, not power versus knowledge, but power knowledge, written as a single, inseparable term. This concept captures one of his most profound insights, that power is not merely repressive, and knowledge is not merely liberating. Instead, they are bound together in a complex relationship. Knowledge produces power, and power produces knowledge. To understand one, you must understand the other. Let's begin by unpacking what he meant. In everyday language, we often imagine power as brute force. Police, armies, governments, and knowledge as truth that stands apart from power. The scientist discovers facts, the teacher transmits wisdom, the journalist uncovers reality. But Foucault insisted this is a misleading picture. Knowledge is never neutral. It is always embedded in systems of power. Take medicine as an example. The rise of modern medical science in the 18th and 19th centuries was not just about discovering truths about the body. It was also about creating systems of control, hospitals, medical records, licensing boards, public health campaigns. These did not simply reflect medical knowledge, they produced it. What counted as illness, who counted as sick, how treatment was defined, all were shaped by institutional power. Medicine, then, is not just knowledge applied, it is power and knowledge intertwined. The same is true of criminology. When criminologists study criminals, they do not simply reveal truths about crime. They also shape how society defines criminality, how laws are enforced, and how punishment is justified. The knowledge of criminology is inseparable from the power of prisons and courts. Without institutions of power, criminology would not exist as a field. But without criminology, institutions of punishment would lack legitimacy. The two sustain each other. This is what Foucault meant by power knowledge, the recognition that knowledge is always a product of power relations, and power always operates through knowledge. They do not exist separately. They are two sides of the same coin. Now, this might sound like a claim that truth does not exist, or that science is just politics by another name. Foucault was often accused of relativism, but his point was subtler. He did not deny that facts exist. Bodies get sick, crimes are committed, people die. What he denied was that facts are ever free from interpretation, classification, and institutional framing. When we call someone mentally ill, for instance, that is not just a description, it is a placement within a system of psychiatry, law, and social norms. This is why power knowledge is such a radical idea. It undermines the comforting notion that truth stands apart from politics. It forces us to see that every claim to knowledge is also a claim to authority. To declare what is true is also to shape how people live. For listeners today, this hits close to home. Consider debates about climate change, vaccines, or artificial intelligence. Scientific knowledge is indispensable, but it is also inseparable from political struggles. Climate data informs laws about industry. Vaccine research leads to mandates and policies. AI research shapes surveillance, policing, and labor markets. Knowledge here is not floating above power, it is entwined with it. Foucault's concept of power knowledge also helps us understand why debates over truth are so heated. When people argue about science, history, or morality, they are not just arguing about facts. They are arguing about authority, about who gets to define reality. This is why truth is always contested. It is not just an intellectual matter, it is a political one. Importantly, Foucault also emphasized that power is not simply repressive. We tend to think of power as something that limits, forbids, or punishes. But he argued that power is also productive. It creates knowledge, categories, and identities. The concept of the homosexual, for example, did not exist until 19th century medical and legal discourses produced it. Once created, It shaped how people understood themselves, how laws were written, and how social norms developed. Power produced an identity category, and knowledge reinforced it. This productive aspect of power is crucial because it shows that resistance cannot simply mean rejecting power. Since power is everywhere, resistance must also operate within and through knowledge. New forms of identity, new discourses, new ways of speaking truth. All of these are modes of resistance. They challenge dominant knowledge not by rejecting truth altogether, but by producing counter-knowledge, by exposing hidden power relations and offering new perspectives. One way to grasp this is to imagine a courtroom. On one side, medical experts testify about a defendant's mental state. On the other, legal authorities interpret laws and precedents. The jury listens, guided by instructions. At every stage, knowledge and power are entangled: the authority of the doctor, the legitimacy of the law, the final decision of the state. The truth that emerges is not simply discovered. It is produced within a system of power knowledge. This may sound unsettling, but it also offers a kind of clarity. It helps explain why institutions fight so hard to control narratives, why governments regulate education, why corporations fund research, why media battles over credibility are so fierce. They are not just contests over information, they are contests over power. Foucault's concept of power knowledge, therefore, remains one of his most enduring contributions. It has influenced fields as diverse as sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, political theory, and science and technology studies. It gave scholars a way to analyze not just what is true, but how truth itself is produced and mobilized. For us, it leaves a challenging question. If knowledge is always bound up with power, how do we tell the difference between truth and manipulation? Foucault would say, there is no easy answer. But recognizing the entanglement is the first step. By asking who produces knowledge, for what purposes, under what conditions, we begin to see truth not as neutral, but as contested terrain. And from there, he would argue, we can begin to imagine new ways of thinking, new spaces of resistance, new forms of life. Few images in philosophy are as haunting or as enduring as the panopticon. Introduced by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century as a design for prisons, it was taken up by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punish as the emblem of modern disciplinary society. The panopticon is, at first glance, a simple architectural idea. Yet in Foucault's hands, it became a metaphor for surveillance, normalization, and the subtle ways power operates in our everyday lives. Imagine a circular prison. At the center stands a tall watchtower. Around the circumference are cells, each with a window facing inward toward the tower. From the tower, a single guard can in principle see every prisoner, but the prisoners cannot see into the tower. They do not know when, or even if, they are being observed, and because of this uncertainty, they behave as if they are always being watched. This, Foucault explained, is the genius and the horror of the panopticon. It eliminates the need for constant force, no whips, no chains, no torture in the public square. Instead, discipline becomes internalized. The prisoner monitors himself, correcting his own behavior because he knows he might be observed. Surveillance, in this model, does not need to be continuous to be effective. The possibility of being watched is enough. For Foucault, the panopticon was not just about prisons. It was a model for modern society as a whole. Schools, factories, hospitals, barracks, even offices, all adopted variations of this logic. Teachers grade students, managers evaluate employees, doctors record symptoms, soldiers drill under watchful eyes. Everywhere, individuals are observed, compared, classified, and corrected. The panopticon becomes less an architecture than a principle of social organization, seeing without being seen. The disturbing part of this model is how it shifts the function of power. In older times, rulers displayed power through spectacle. The scaffold, the execution, the battlefield. Power was visible, dramatic, and often violent. In the panopticon, power becomes invisible. The guard may not even be there. The prisoner cannot know, yet the prisoner behaves. Power, in this sense, becomes more efficient, less costly, and far more pervasive. It produces what Foucault called docile bodies, individuals who regulate themselves, who internalize authority, who conform without direct coercion. This is where the metaphor becomes chillingly relevant for our own time. Consider surveillance cameras on city streets. Most of the time, no one is actively watching them, but their presence is enough to alter behavior. People hesitate before crossing against a light, knowing they could be recorded. Or think about the digital world. Our online actions are constantly tracked by governments, corporations, algorithms. We rarely know who is looking, when, or for what purpose. Yet the awareness that we might be watched shapes how we act, what we post, what we search. In fact, the digital age has created a kind of hyper-panopticon. Social media thrives on visibility, likes, shares, comments, so that we internalize surveillance not just from above, but from one another. We become both the observed and the observers, monitoring ourselves and each other in a vast network of watching. Unlike Bentham's prison, where the guard was in the tower, today we all inhabit both the cells and the tower simultaneously. For Foucault, the point of highlighting the panopticon was not to declare doom, but to reveal how deeply power operates in subtle, everyday ways. It was a warning. Do not think that because the scaffold has vanished, power has disappeared. It has simply shifted form, becoming quieter, more intimate, more internal. One of the most unsettling aspects of this analysis is how power and freedom intertwine. In the panopticon, prisoners may technically be free to move, to speak, to act. But because they internalize the gaze, their freedom is shaped, narrowed, disciplined. This blurring of freedom and control is what makes modern society so difficult to analyze. We feel free, yet our choices are structured by norms, surveillance, and expectations. The panopticon helps us see this paradox. Yet, as always with Foucault, the story does not end in despair. The very fact that power relies on surveillance means that resistance is possible. People can refuse visibility, subvert observation, or use visibility strategically. Activists, for example, often expose themselves, deliberately occupying public spaces, live-streaming protests, to turn surveillance back against authority. In this way, the panopticon is not just a model of control, but also a stage for resistance. It is worth remembering, too, that Bentham's original panopticon was never built. It remained a design, a dream of perfect visibility. Foucault's genius was to show that even without its physical construction, the principle of the panopticon had seeped into the fabric of modern life. The idea itself was enough to transform institutions. For listeners today, the panopticon remains one of Foucault's most powerful metaphors. It captures the unease of living in a world where privacy feels fragile, where data is constantly collected, where the line between freedom and control blurs. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much are we shaping ourselves for the gaze of others? How often do we self-censor? Not because someone tells us to, but because we fear being seen. And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, if we are all prisoners in this vast panopticon, who exactly is in the tower? Before Foucault became the thinker of prisons, sexuality, and biopolitics, he made his mark with a book that was both audacious and unsettling. Madness and Civilization, first published in 1961. It was his doctoral thesis, but it read less like an academic treatise and more like a sweeping history of human fear, shame, and exclusion. In it, Foucault asked a simple but disturbing question: how did Western societies come to treat madness the way they do? The answer, he argued, was not progress but confinement. The story begins in the Renaissance. In the late Middle Ages, madness was still seen as part of the human world, sometimes even carrying a strange, almost mystical authority. Mad figures wandered cities, spoke truths in riddles, or served as reminders of life's fragility. Madness was feared, yes, but it was also woven into the cultural imagination, appearing in art, literature, and religion as a symbol of human folly. But in the 17th century, something changed. Across Europe, the Great Confinement began. Thousands of people deemed idle, deviant, or insane were rounded up and placed in newly established institutions, the hôpitaux généraux in France, workhouses in England, houses of correction in other countries. The mad were confined alongside beggars, criminals, and the poor. These institutions were less about care than about control. Society, Foucault argued, was trying to cleanse itself of those who did not fit. Here, Foucault disrupted the comforting narrative of progress. We like to think that the rise of asylums represented a humanitarian advance, replacing chains and superstition with treatment and science. But he argued the opposite, that the asylum was not born of compassion, but of exclusion. Madness was silenced, hidden away, managed rather than understood. This analysis was not just historical, it was political. By tracing how societies defined and confined the mad, Foucault revealed how categories of normality and deviance are constructed. What counts as sane or insane is not a timeless truth, but a social judgment enforced by institutions. And those institutions, hospitals, asylums, medical authorities, gain power by claiming to speak the truth about madness. One of Foucault's most striking points was about the role of reason. In modern thought, we like to believe that reason triumphed over superstition, that science liberated us from ignorance. But Foucault argued that the rise of reason was bound up with the exclusion of unreason. Modern rationality defined itself not by including madness, but by locking it away. The Enlightenment, in his telling, was not simply an age of light, but an age that cast shadows, silencing voices that did not fit the new order. Consider the asylum. In its early days, it was not a place of medical treatment, but of moral instruction. Patients were subjected to discipline, routine, and silence. Doctors claimed authority not by curing illness, but by imposing norms of behavior. Madness, Foucault suggested, was less treated than tamed. It was forced to conform to the demands of reason and order. This raises unsettling questions for us today. How much of modern psychiatry is genuinely medical, and how much is a continuation of control by other means? When we diagnose, medicate, or institutionalize, are we healing, or are we enforcing conformity to norms of productivity and rationality? Foucault did not deny that mental suffering is real, but he insisted that how we interpret and treat it is shaped by social and political forces, not simply by science. For listeners in our time, the relevance is striking. The global rise in diagnoses of depression, anxiety, and ADHD, the controversies over medication, the debates about neurodiversity, all echo Foucault's argument that madness is never a purely medical category. It is entangled with norms of work, education, and social order. Who decides what counts as disorder? Who benefits from labeling, treating, or excluding certain forms of difference? These are Foucauldian questions. Madness and civilization was controversial from the start. Psychiatrists accused Foucault of caricaturing their history. Historians criticized his sweeping narrative, saying it ignored complexities. Yet the book electrified readers because it forced them to rethink what they thought they knew. It was not a gentle critique, it was a challenge to the very foundations of modern reason. Importantly, the book also foreshadowed themes that would run through Foucault's entire career. The exclusion of madness prefigures the exclusion of prisoners, sexual minorities, and other groups. The asylum becomes a model for how power operates, by separating normal from abnormal, sane from insane, citizen from deviant. In this sense, madness and civilization is the seed from which all his later work grows. And for Foucault himself, it was personal. He had struggled with depression, suicidal impulses, and the experience of psychiatric institutions in his own youth. His critique was not detached scholarship, it was rooted in lived experience. He knew what it meant to feel the weight of exclusion, the authority of doctors, the silence imposed by labels. This gave the book its urgency, its edge. By rethinking madness, Foucault forced us to rethink ourselves. What we call reason, he suggested, is always built on exclusions. What we call progress is always shadowed by control, and what we call truth is always bound up with power. This was his first great provocation, and from here, he would go on to probe prisons, sexuality, and society itself. But it all began with madness, with the unsettling recognition that the line between sanity and insanity is not natural, but historical, political, and deeply human. To understand Michel Foucault, one must also understand Friedrich Nietzsche. Of all the philosophers who influenced him, Nietzsche was perhaps the most decisive. From Nietzsche, Foucault inherited not only key concepts, but also a spirit of suspicion, a willingness to question morality, truth, and knowledge at their very roots. Their intellectual kinship runs so deep that some have described Foucault as a modern Nietzsche, carrying forward the project of unmasking the hidden forces beneath our most cherished beliefs. What did Foucault take from Nietzsche? Above all, he took the idea that history is not a story of progress, but a battlefield of power. Nietzsche rejected the comforting notion that morality evolved naturally toward higher forms. Instead, he argued that our values, good, evil, truth, justice, emerged from struggles of domination. The will to power, Nietzsche's term for the fundamental drive of life, shaped not only politics, but also morality, knowledge, and culture. This view deeply resonated with Foucault. Like Nietzsche, he saw no timeless truths. Instead, he saw discourses, institutions, and practices forged in conflict. Where Nietzsche unmasked the genealogy of morality, Foucault unmasked the genealogy of madness, punishment, and sexuality. In both cases, the point was to reveal that what we take as natural or inevitable is, in fact, contingent and historical. Consider Foucault's genealogical method. The very word comes directly from Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. Nietzsche traced how concepts like good and evil emerged from the resentment of the weak against the strong, how morality was not handed down from heaven but created in human conflict. Foucault adopted this method, applying it to modern institutions. When he examined prisons, for example, he did not see them as natural or inevitable. He saw them as products of historical struggles, new ways of exercising power that replaced older ones. Genealogy, for Foucault, was a way of showing that nothing is eternal. Nietzsche also gave Foucault a way to think about truth. Nietzsche had declared that truths are illusions, we have forgotten are illusions. He meant that what we call truth is simply a set of metaphors, hardened by habit, given the appearance of permanence. Foucault echoed this idea when he argued that knowledge and truth are bound up with power. Truth, in his account, is not discovered, but produced, sustained by institutions and practices. But there was another, more personal connection between them, their shared experience of marginality. Nietzsche was a solitary figure, misunderstood in his time, often in poor health, writing from the edges of the academic world. Foucault, too, felt the weight of exclusion, struggling with depression, alienated by his sexuality, skeptical of the institutions around him. Both turned their personal distance into philosophical insight, seeing what others could not because they themselves lived on the margins. This Nietzschean inheritance also explains Foucault's suspicion of grand narratives. He rejected the Marxist idea that history inevitably leads toward liberation, just as Nietzsche had rejected the Enlightenment's faith in progress. For Foucault, as for Nietzsche, history has no predetermined direction. It is shaped by forces, accidents, and struggles. This was both unsettling and liberating. It meant that we could not rely on destiny to save us, but it also meant that nothing was fixed. Change, though uncertain, was always possible. There are, of course, differences between them. Nietzsche's will to power was a metaphysical concept, an underlying force of life. Foucault avoided metaphysics. He was less interested in ultimate forces and more interested in specific practices, institutions, and discourses. Where Nietzsche spoke of morality in sweeping terms, Foucault analyzed prisons, hospitals, and sexuality in minute detail. Yet the family resemblance is unmistakable. Both sought to unmask, to destabilize, to show that what we call truth is bound up with power. Their relationship also came into focus in how they were received. Both were accused of nihilism, of undermining truth and morality. Both provoked admiration and outrage in equal measure. And both have been taken up by later thinkers as guides to critique modern society. Nietzsche by existentialists and postmodernists, Foucault by feminists, queer theorists, and critical scholars of power. For listeners today, the Nietzschean thread in Foucault's work is crucial. It helps us see that his critique of power is not simply about institutions, but about values themselves. When Foucault questions madness, crime, or sexuality, he is not just asking how we treat these phenomena. He is asking, why do we call them what we do? Who decided that this is madness, that this is crime, that this is perversion? These are Nietzschean questions, taken up and sharpened for the modern world. And like Nietzsche, Foucault leaves us with a challenge. If truth is bound up with power, if morality is historical, if nothing is fixed, how should we live? Nietzsche's answer was the figure of the Übermensch, the creator of new values. Foucault's answer was more modest, but no less radical, the care of the self. The cultivation of new ways of living, the refusal to be trapped by existing categories. Both invite us to imagine life differently, to embrace freedom not as a gift, but as a practice. In this sense, Foucault can be seen as a Nietzsche for the late 20th century, armed not with metaphysical declarations, but with historical genealogies, not with proclamations of will, but with analyses of institutions. Both share a spirit of critique, a suspicion of certainties, a refusal to bow to the supposed inevitability of truth. And both, in their own ways, remind us that philosophy is not just about abstract thought. It is about life itself. How we live, how we resist, how we become who we are. Throughout his career, Michel Foucault had an uneasy relationship with Marxism. Living in France in the mid-20th century, he could not avoid it. The French Communist Party was powerful in universities, intellectual circles, and even in the streets. Many of Foucault's contemporaries were committed Marxists, interpreting philosophy, literature, and politics through the lens of class struggle and historical materialism. Yet Foucault always stood at a distance, sometimes close, sometimes critical, always in tension. Understanding his complicated engagement with Marxism is essential, because it reveals both what he shared with Marxist thought and what made his philosophy so distinctive. Let's start with the points of contact. Foucault was not a Marxist in the sense of embracing its doctrines, but he did share certain key concerns. Like Marx, Foucault was interested in power. Both saw that societies are structured by inequalities, that institutions serve not only neutral purposes, but also reinforce domination. When Foucault analyzed prisons, hospitals, or sexuality, he was doing something that resonated with Marxist critiques of capitalism, showing how institutions maintain order, discipline bodies, and regulate life. For example, when Marx examined factories, he saw how industrial capitalism created a disciplined workforce. When Foucault examined prisons, he saw a similar logic at work, institutions that shaped individuals to be compliant, productive, and normalized. Both agreed that power was not simply a matter of laws and governments, but was embedded in everyday practices. Yet, Foucault's approach was different. Marx located power primarily in the economy, in the ownership of production, in the struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat. For Marx, ideology was a tool by which the ruling class maintained control. Foucault, by contrast, resisted reducing power to economics. He argued that power is diffuse, operating not just from the top down, but throughout society. Power is present in schools, hospitals, clinics, families, not just in factories or states. He was less concerned with class struggle and more with the microphysics of power, the small, everyday ways in which people are observed, categorized, and disciplined. This difference often put him at odds with Marxist thinkers. Some accused him of ignoring class, of fragmenting politics into scattered struggles, instead of uniting them under the banner of revolution. For committed Marxists, Foucault seemed too skeptical of grand narratives, too unwilling to endorse the proletariat as the agent of history. But Foucault's critique of Marxism went deeper. He rejected what he saw as Marxism's teleological structure, the belief that history moves inevitably toward revolution, that the contradictions of capitalism will necessarily produce its downfall. For Foucault, history has no guaranteed direction. It is shaped by accidents, struggles, contingencies. To assume an inevitable outcome, he thought, was to fall into the trap of determinism. At the same time, Foucault did not simply dismiss Marx. In fact, he once said, "I am neither an adversary nor a partisan of Marx. I use Marx when I need him." This reflects his pragmatic approach. He treated Marx as part of the toolbox, borrowing insights without embracing the whole system. For example, Foucault drew on Marxist analyses of labor and exploitation when discussing prisons, showing how discipline created a more obedient workforce. But he also moved beyond Marx by highlighting areas Marx had overlooked, such as sexuality, psychiatry, and medical institutions. The tension came to a head in the 1970s, when Foucault became politically active. He was involved in protests against prisons, in movements for prisoners' rights, and critiques of psychiatric institutions. Many of his allies were Marxists, but Foucault refused to commit to a Marxist framework. He resisted joining parties, resisted ideological conformity, resisted the idea of a single revolutionary subject. Instead, he emphasized local struggles, specific resistances to specific forms of power. This stance sometimes frustrated his comrades. To them, Foucault's refusal to ground his critique in class struggle looked like political evasion. To Foucault, however, it was a way of keeping politics open, experimental, and plural. He did not want to replace one orthodoxy with another. He wanted to show how power worked in multiple domains and how resistance could emerge in many forms. The result is that Foucault and Marxism remain in a kind of dialogue. Some Marxist scholars have incorporated his insights, using power knowledge to enrich critiques of capitalism. Others see him as a rival, whose skepticism undermines the unity of revolutionary struggle. Yet even those who disagree with him cannot ignore him. He expanded the field of critique, moving beyond the economy to show how power permeates medicine, sexuality, education, and everyday life. For listeners today, this tension still matters. Debates about capitalism, inequality, and exploitation continue, but so do debates about race, gender, sexuality, surveillance, and health. Foucault reminds us that while class is crucial, it is not the only axis of power. By broadening the field, he made space for struggles that Marxism alone could not fully explain. And perhaps that is his lasting contribution to this dialogue. He did not overthrow Marx, but he refused to let Marx be the only guide. He insisted that power is everywhere, not just in class struggle. He insisted that resistance is multiple, not singular, and he insisted that history has no predetermined path. In this way, Foucault remained both close to Marx and irreducibly different, a thinker who stood in the same arena, but always from an angle all his own. Few moments capture Michel Foucault's intellectual style as vividly as his 1971 televised debate with the American linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky. The event took place at Eindhoven University in the Netherlands, moderated by the Dutch philosopher Fons Elders. On one side sat Chomsky, already well known for his revolutionary theories of language and his fierce criticism of American imperialism. On the other side sat Foucault, still emerging as a radical French thinker whose analyses of power were beginning to shake philosophy and politics alike. The subject was justice, human nature, and political struggle. What emerged was less a meeting of minds than a clash of worldviews. For listeners today, the debate remains striking, not only for the sharpness of the exchange, but for how it highlights the profound differences between two of the 20th century's most influential intellectuals. Chomsky's position was grounded in his belief in a universal human nature. As a linguist, he had argued that all humans share an innate capacity for language, a deep grammatical structure embedded in the mind. Extending this insight to politics, Chomsky suggested that there must also be universal moral structures, principles of justice that transcend history and culture. For him, this universal morality justified resistance to oppression. People have a natural sense of justice, and political systems should reflect it. Foucault's response was characteristically unsettling. He rejected the idea of an essential human nature. For him, human nature was itself a historical construct, shaped by discourses and institutions. What we call nature, he argued, is really the product of power knowledge systems. Madness, sexuality, even reason itself. None of these are timeless truths, but categories created by history. Justice, too, is not a universal given, but a product of social arrangements. The debate reached its most dramatic point when Foucault declared, "The idea of justice in itself is an idea which in effect has been invented and put to work in different societies as a weapon of a certain political, economic, and social battle." For Chomsky, this was shocking. He insisted that without universal principles of justice, we could not condemn oppression. If justice is relative, how can we say slavery is wrong or war is unjust? Foucault countered by saying that our judgments are always situated. We do not appeal to timeless truths. We fight in the present, using the resources available to us. To speak of justice, for him, was not to invoke a universal standard, but to engage in a struggle, a battle over meaning, power, and practice. The clash could not have been sharper. Chomsky believed in human universals, Foucault in historical contingencies. Chomsky believed justice was a natural moral truth, Foucault that it was a political weapon. Chomsky sought a foundation for resistance, Foucault exposed the fragility of foundations themselves. For many viewers, the debate was disorienting. Chomsky came across as earnest, moral, principled. Foucault appeared cold, clinical, even ruthless in his refusal to affirm universal values. Yet his position had its own radical edge. By rejecting universal justice, He freed resistance from being tied to abstract ideals. He insisted that struggle could be waged here and now on specific fronts, without waiting for agreement on universal truths. This difference reflects their deeper philosophical orientations. Chomsky's work in linguistics is rooted in the search for structures, deep grammar, universals, constants. His politics extend that impulse, searching for universal human rights and moral truths. Foucault's work, by contrast, is rooted in history and contingency. He saw no deep structures, only shifting regimes of power and knowledge. His politics were skeptical of universals, focusing instead on exposing domination in its specific forms. The debate remains one of the great intellectual encounters of the 20th century. It dramatizes a tension that still shapes political thought today. On one side, the appeal to universal rights and justice as the foundation of resistance. On the other, the suspicion that such universals are themselves products of power, and that resistance must be grounded in concrete struggles rather than eternal truths. For listeners today, the Chomsky-Foucault debate resonates in debates over human rights, cultural relativism, and global justice. Should we appeal to universal principles, like human rights, to condemn abuses? Or should we recognize that even the language of rights is historically situated, tied to specific political contexts? Chomsky would say universals are essential. Foucault would say universals are illusions. What makes the debate so compelling is that both are, in their own ways, right. Without universals, resistance risks fragmentation with no common ground. But with universals, resistance risks imposing one culture's values on another, masking power under the guise of truth. The tension is real, unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable. Foucault, for his part, left the debate with his reputation sharpened. He had shown himself willing to confront even sympathetic allies, to reject even the most cherished ideals if he believed they concealed power. He would later remark that he was completely astonished by Chomsky's belief in justice as universal. For him, it was a reminder that philosophy is not about consensus, but about unsettling assumptions. In the end, the Chomsky-Foucault debate is less about who was right and more about the questions it leaves us with. Can we fight oppression without universal truths? Can we appeal to justice without reproducing power? Can we live without foundations, or must we always seek them? These are not just academic puzzles. They are the dilemmas of politics, the dilemmas of life. And they remind us of what makes Foucault such a compelling figure. He does not give us easy answers. He gives us sharper questions. For much of his life, Michel Foucault was seen not as a political activist, but as a theorist, someone dissecting institutions and discourses with clinical precision. Yet, in the 1970s, as his work on prisons and power gained momentum, Foucault increasingly stepped into the arena of direct political action. He was not content to remain in libraries and lecture halls. He wanted philosophy to touch reality, to intervene in struggles, to be a tool for resistance. One of the most striking examples was his involvement in the Prison Information Group, Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, or GIP, founded in 1971 with other intellectuals, including Jean-Marie Domenach and Daniel Defert, Foucault's longtime partner. The group's mission was not to represent prisoners, but to give prisoners a voice. They distributed questionnaires in prisons, published testimonies, and organized campaigns to expose conditions of confinement. This was a radical move. Instead of speaking for prisoners, the GIP let prisoners speak for themselves. Foucault insisted that those most affected by power should have the authority to describe it. He used his own visibility as a well-known intellectual to amplify voices that had been silenced. For him, this was not charity, it was politics. It was about disrupting the structures that kept prisoners invisible and powerless. The GIP became a model of what Foucault meant by local struggles. Rather than pursuing grand revolutions or abstract ideals, he engaged with specific institutions and concrete injustices. He believed that change happens not through sweeping ideological battles, but through targeted resistance against particular forms of domination. In this sense, his activism mirrored his philosophy, decentralized, plural, pragmatic. Foucault's political engagement extended beyond prisons. He spoke out against psychiatric abuses, defended immigrant workers, and opposed state repression of protests. He joined demonstrations, gave interviews, and signed petitions. He even traveled abroad to observe and comment on struggles in other countries, from the Iranian Revolution in 1979 to the Solidarity movement in Poland in the early 1980s. The Iranian case is particularly interesting. Foucault visited Iran during the revolutionary period, writing sympathetic articles about the movement that overthrew the Shah. He was fascinated by what he called the political spirituality of the uprising, a collective energy that resisted Western categories of secular politics. Yet this position later drew sharp criticism, especially after the Islamic Republic imposed repression. Critics accused Foucault of romanticizing revolution, of failing to anticipate its authoritarian turn. This episode highlights both his willingness to experiment with political ideas and the risks of his skepticism toward universal values. What is consistent across these engagements is Foucault's suspicion of centralized authority. He distrusted political parties, ideologies, and leaders who claimed to speak for the people. He preferred horizontal movements, grassroots voices, and struggles that challenged power from below. He saw resistance as multiple, scattered, and ongoing, not as a single revolution that would solve everything. This made him an outlier in French intellectual life, where Marxism and revolutionary rhetoric still held sway. Many leftists wanted him to commit to the proletariat, to endorse socialism, to choose sides. But Foucault resisted. He believed that power is too diffuse to be captured by a single struggle. For him, the fight was not only against capitalism, but also against prisons, psychiatry, medical norms, sexual repression, and countless other forms of control. His political engagement also raised questions about the role of intellectuals. Traditionally, French intellectuals, figures like Sartre, saw themselves as the conscience of society, speaking for the oppressed. Foucault challenged this model. He argued that intellectuals should not claim to speak on behalf of others. Instead, they should create spaces for others to speak. The role of the intellectual was not to represent, but to facilitate, to amplify, to destabilize authority. For listeners today, this vision of politics is particularly relevant. In an age of grassroots activism, decentralized movements, and digital platforms, Foucault's emphasis on local struggles and distributed resistance resonates strongly. His suspicion of universal programs, while controversial, anticipated many contemporary movements that reject rigid ideologies in favor of flexible, intersectional, and pragmatic activism. But Foucault's politics also raise hard questions. Without universal values, how do we judge struggle? Without central organization, how do movements sustain themselves? Without ideology, how do they avoid fragmentation? These challenges remain unresolved. Yet perhaps that is the point. Foucault never promised easy solutions. He saw politics as an ongoing struggle, a field of contestation, not a problem with a final answer. What stands out most in Foucault's activism is its consistency with his philosophy. He analyzed power as diffuse, and he practiced politics as diffuse. He critiqued representation, and he refused to speak for others. He rejected teleology, and he embraced local, open-ended struggles. In this way, his activism was not a side project, but an extension of his thought. In the end, the political Foucault was neither a revolutionary in the Marxist sense, nor a reformist in the liberal sense. He was something else, a thinker-activist who sought to make visible the invisible, to destabilize what seemed natural, to create space for resistance where none seemed possible. And in doing so, he left us with a vision of politics, not as a march toward utopia, but as a practice of freedom, lived daily, fought in small battles, always unfinished. In the late 1970s, Michel Foucault introduced a term that would become central to political theory: governmentality. At first glance, it may sound like just another word for government. But for Foucault, governmentality meant something far more expansive. It referred to the ways in which human conduct is shaped, managed, and directed, not just by states, but by institutions, professions, norms, and even by individuals themselves. He called it, memorably, the conduct of conduct. To grasp this idea, let's step back. When we think of government, we often imagine the state, laws, policies, police, armies. But Foucault argued that this is only one part of a much larger field of power. Government, in his sense, is any attempt to guide behavior, whether it's a teacher instructing students, a doctor advising patients, a religious leader guiding souls, or a company shaping consumers. Governmentality is the art of governing, broadly understood, across multiple levels of life. This insight grew out of his lectures at the Collège de France in 1978 and 1979, particularly security, territory, population, and the birth of biopolitics. Here, he traced the historical development of governance, showing how it shifted from ruling over territories to managing populations, from enforcing obedience to fostering self-regulation. One of Foucault's key claims was that modern government relies not only on coercion, but also on freedom. Unlike older forms of rule, which demanded obedience through force, modern government often seeks to shape the choices individuals make freely. A public health campaign, for instance, does not force you to stop smoking. It provides information, warnings, and incentives, guiding you toward making the right decision yourself. This is governmentality at work, shaping conduct not by direct command, but by structuring the conditions under which choices are made. This makes governmentality both subtle and powerful. It does not appear as domination, but as guidance, management, and care. Yet, in shaping behavior so deeply, it often exerts more pervasive influence than traditional forms of rule. It governs not only what we do, but how we think about what we do. One striking example is education. Schools do not just transmit knowledge. They also teach discipline, punctuality, obedience, cooperation. They shape children into future workers and citizens, not only by curriculum, but by routines, schedules, and norms. In this sense, schools are not just educational institutions, they are sites of governmentality, molding conduct at the most basic level. Another example is health. Public health campaigns, medical advice, dietary guidelines, all of these shape how people eat, exercise, sleep, and care for their bodies. They operate through expertise, statistics, and risk management. We learn to monitor ourselves, counting calories, tracking steps, measuring blood pressure. Here, governmentality works by encouraging self-governance, making individuals responsible for their own health in ways that align with broader social goals. Foucault also showed how governmentality developed historically. In medieval times, rulers saw their task as securing territory and subjects. By the modern era, however, the focus shifted toward populations. Governments became concerned with birth rates, mortality, health, productivity. Power was exercised less through punishment and more through management, managing life itself. This is where governmentality intersects with his concept of biopolitics, the regulation of populations through health, statistics, and norms. But governmentality is not limited to the state. It extends into families, workplaces, and even personal habits. Parents govern children, companies govern employees, individuals govern themselves. In this sense, we are all governed and governing at once, caught in webs of influence that shape our conduct. For listeners today, the relevance is obvious. Think about apps that track your sleep, heart rate, or productivity. Think about wellness culture, where people monitor and optimize themselves in the name of health. Think about corporate policies that encourage work-life balance, not out of altruism, but to increase efficiency. These are all forms of governmentality, guiding conduct through norms, incentives, and self-monitoring rather than direct force. Foucault's concept also helps explain why modern societies often feel both free and constrained. We are told we are free to choose, but our choices are shaped, nudged, structured. We are not forced to live a certain way, but we are guided into living in ways that align with economic, political, or cultural priorities. This is the paradox of governmentality. Freedom is not the opposite of power, but one of its tools. Critics have debated the implications of this idea. Some worry it undermines the possibility of universal rights or justice, making everything seem like control. Others find it liberating, showing how resistance can happen in everyday practices of self-care, community, or refusal. For Foucault, governmentality was not about despair, but about analysis, seeing how power operates in order to resist and reimagine it. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of governmentality is that it makes us complicit. We govern ourselves according to norms we did not create. We internalize health advice, workplace expectations, consumer desires, often without questioning whose interests they serve. In this sense, the conduct of conduct is also self-conduct. We are both the governors and the governed. Yet Foucault also saw potential here. If governmentality shapes us, then we can reshape it. If power operates through norms, then new norms can be created. If freedom is used to govern, then freedom can also be used to resist. The task for him was not to escape power. That is impossible, but to find new ways of living within it, to experiment with forms of life that do not simply reproduce domination. In the end, governmentality is one of Foucault's most powerful concepts, because it shifts our attention from the spectacular to the ordinary. Power is not only in the state or the law. It is in classrooms, clinics, offices, families, and habits. It is in how we wake up, how we eat, how we work, how we care for ourselves. To see this is to see that politics is not only out there, but in here, in our daily conduct, in the conduct of conduct. When Michel Foucault turned his attention to biopolitics in the late 1970s, he gave us one of his most powerful concepts, a lens through which to see how power has come to govern, not just territory, not just institutions, but life itself. Biopolitics, for Foucault, was the management of populations, birth and death, health and illness, fertility and mortality. Where sovereign power once demanded, do this or die, biopolitical power whispers, live like this, thrive like this, survive like this. It is a power not of swords, but of statistics, not of punishment, but of management. This idea grew out of his College de France lectures, particularly security, territory, population, and the birth of biopolitics. Here, he argued that modern states increasingly concern themselves with the biological well-being of populations. Governments tracked birth rates, life expectancy, and epidemics. They created vaccination programs, sanitation systems, housing codes. These interventions were not simply about compassion, they were about power. Healthy populations are productive populations, and modern states needed productive citizens to sustain economies and armies. Foucault contrasted biopolitics with older forms of power. In the classical sovereign model, rulers exercised power through the right to take life. The king could execute, punish, or send subjects to war. Biopolitics, by contrast, is about fostering life, optimizing health, prolonging survival. Yet this does not make it benign. By deciding which lives to foster, states also decide which lives can be neglected, abandoned, or sacrificed. In Foucault's haunting phrase, biopolitics always includes the possibility of making live and letting die. This becomes especially clear when biopolitics meets neoliberalism, the economic doctrine that rose to prominence in the late 20th century. Neoliberalism, in simple terms, is the belief that markets should govern not only economies, but society itself. That competition, efficiency, and profit are the guiding principles of human life. For Foucault, neoliberalism was not just an economic policy, it was a mode of governmentality. It reshaped individuals into what he called entrepreneurs of the self. Under neoliberalism, people are no longer just workers or citizens, they are investments, capital, projects. Health becomes an individual responsibility. Your body is your capital, and you must manage it wisely. Education becomes human capital, a way to enhance your market value. Even personal relationships become investments in social capital. In this world, life itself is economized. Think of the fitness tracker on your wrist. It counts your steps, monitors your sleep, tracks your calories. It encourages you to optimize your body as if it were a small business. Think of the gig economy, where workers must constantly market themselves, manage their ratings, and compete for opportunities. Or think of higher education, where students are told to treat themselves as investments, accumulating skills and credentials for future profit. This is neoliberal biopolitics in action, the merging of life and market, health and competition, biology and economics. Foucault's analysis here was prescient. Writing in the late 1970s, he examined neoliberal thinkers such as Friedrich Hayek and Gary Becker, showing how their theories went beyond economics into a philosophy of life. He saw how neoliberalism encouraged individuals to govern themselves, not out of obedience, but out of economic rationality. You quit smoking, not because the state commands it, but because it makes you a more efficient investment. You study, not for wisdom, but to increase your human capital. Freedom itself becomes a market strategy. This is where biopolitics reveals its darker side. By managing life through economic rationality, neoliberalism creates new inequalities. Those who can optimize themselves thrive, those who cannot fall behind. Health becomes a matter of personal responsibility, ignoring the structural forces that shape it. Poverty is redefined not as misfortune, but as failure to invest properly in oneself. And all of this happens under the guise of freedom. The COVID-19 pandemic made these dynamics starkly visible. Governments tracked infection rates, deaths, and vaccinations with unprecedented intensity. Classic biopolitical management. At the same time, individuals were told to manage their own risk, monitor their health, and act responsibly. The pandemic was a biopolitical event, par excellence, life and death governed through statistics, policies, and individual self-regulation. For Foucault, this would have been the ultimate confirmation of his analysis. Yet he also saw biopolitics as a site of resistance. If life is governed, then life can resist. New social movements, feminist, queer, anti-racist, environmental, often mobilize around the politics of life itself. They demand recognition of marginalized lives, protection of vulnerable populations, care for the planet as the condition of life. These movements show that biopolitics is not only a tool of control, but also a battlefield where new possibilities can emerge. For listeners today, the relevance could not be clearer. We live in a world where health apps, economic policies, and political campaigns all converge on life itself. The food we eat, the air we breathe, the bodies we inhabit, all are sites of management and contestation. Foucault helps us see that this is not accidental. It is the logic of modern power. And it leaves us with a provocative question. If life has become the object of politics, how can we reclaim life as the object of freedom? In 1976, Michel Foucault published the first volume of what would become one of his most influential works, The History of Sexuality. It was meant to be a multi-volume series, and though he only completed 3 volumes in his lifetime, its impact has been enormous. At its core, the project sought to overturn one of the most persistent assumptions about modern society, that we are sexually repressed. The conventional story goes something like this. In Victorian times, sexuality was hidden, silenced, pushed into the private sphere. Families and churches told people not to talk about sex. Desire was repressed, and liberation came only in the 20th century with the sexual revolution. But Foucault argued that this story is misleading. He called it the repressive hypothesis. Far from repressing sexuality, he insisted, modern society has been obsessed with it. Think about it, sexuality is not just a private matter. It is the subject of endless discussion by doctors, priests, teachers, scientists, and politicians. Children's sexuality, women's sexuality, homosexuality, homosexuals, deviants, perversions. These categories multiplied across the 19th and 20th centuries. Sex was not silenced. It was studied, classified, and regulated. This leads to one of Foucault's most radical insights. Power does not repress sexuality, it produces it. By this, he meant that modern institutions did not simply forbid sex, but actively created discourses around it. In Foucault's famous phrase, the sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. This is what he meant when he spoke of the deployment of sexuality. Sexuality became a field where power and knowledge intersected, where science, morality, medicine, and law converged to produce truths about bodies and desires. Far from being hidden, sex became a central concern of governance. One striking example is the rise of psychiatry. Doctors claimed authority over sexual behavior, defining what was normal and what was deviant. Masturbation, for instance, was pathologized, seen as harmful and dangerous. Entire medical discourses arose around it, creating anxieties that shaped the lives of children and parents alike. Similarly, homosexuality was classified as a disease, making those who experienced same-sex desire into patients rather than sinners. In each case, sexuality was not repressed but medicalized, brought into discourse. Another example is education. Schools introduced sex education, but not simply to liberate desire. Rather, it was to regulate it, teaching children when, how, and with whom sex was appropriate. Families, too, became sites of sexual discourse. Parents monitored children, doctors monitored parents, and the cycle of surveillance deepened. For Foucault, all of this showed that sexuality was not outside power, but at its very heart. By regulating sex, societies regulate populations. Birth rates, fertility, health, and morality all hinge on sexuality. This makes sexuality a key site of biopolitics, the management of life itself. Now, this may sound abstract, but its consequences are deeply personal. It means that our very identities, straight, gay, bisexual, transgender, are products of historical discourses. It does not mean they are unreal, but it means they are not timeless. They are ways of classifying, ways of speaking, ways of living that emerged under particular conditions of power. This is why the history of sexuality has been so influential in fields like queer theory, gender studies, and feminist thought. It provided tools for questioning the categories that define us, for showing how identities are shaped by power, and for imagining new ways of living sexuality. But Foucault's analysis was not only about sexuality itself, it was about power more broadly. He used sexuality to illustrate his larger point, that power is not simply repressive but productive, that it shapes knowledge, identities, and bodies. Sexuality was his case study, his proof that modern power works not by silencing, but by multiplying discourses. For listeners today, the relevance could not be clearer. Debates over gender, sexual orientation, identity, and bodily autonomy are not just private matters. They are political struggles over who gets to define normality, whose lives are recognized, and whose desires are legitimate. From laws regulating marriage to controversies over trans rights, sexuality remains a battlefield of power knowledge. What makes Foucault's argument so powerful is that it resists both despair and triumphalism. On the one hand, he shows that there is no simple liberation, no moment when sexuality becomes free from power. On the other hand, he shows that power always creates spaces for resistance. If identities are produced, they can be reimagined. If discourses regulate, they can also be subverted. If sexuality is shaped by power, it is also a site where new forms of life can emerge. This is why the history of sexuality remains essential reading. It is not a history of sex itself, but a history of how sex became central to politics, medicine, morality, and identity. It forces us to see that what feels most intimate, our desires, our pleasures, our bodies, is also what connects us most deeply to power. And it leaves us with a challenging thought. If sexuality has always been a site of power, then the question is not whether we are free, but how we can use sexuality as a space of freedom, creativity, and resistance. For all his influence, Michel Foucault was, and remains, a deeply controversial figure. Few philosophers have attracted such admiration and such hostility at the same time. His critics came from many directions: Marxists who thought he neglected class struggle, liberals who thought he undermined universal rights, conservatives who thought he dissolved moral standards, and even fellow postmodernists who found his positions unsettling. To understand his legacy, we must confront these critiques head-on, because they reveal not only how his ideas were received, but also how they continue to provoke debate. One of the most common charges against Foucault is relativism. Since he argued that truth is bound up with power, critics claimed he was denying the very possibility of objective truth. If all knowledge is shaped by power, does that mean all knowledge is equally valid? Does that mean there is no distinction between science and superstition, fact and fiction? This accusation was sharpened in the so-called science wars of the 1990s, when scientists and philosophers clashed over whether science was a socially constructed discourse or a description of objective reality. Foucault's name was often invoked as a symbol of the skeptical side. Related to this is the charge of nihilism. If Foucault denied universal truth, morality, or justice, then what foundation remained for resistance? Without universals, critics asked, how can we say that oppression is wrong? How can we fight for human rights if we cannot affirm their universal validity? To some, Foucault seemed to undermine the very ground of political struggle. Foucault himself resisted these labels. He insisted he was not a relativist because he did not claim all discourses were equal. Some discourses, he argued, have more power, more authority, more consequences. His point was not that truth does not exist, but that what we call truth is always entangled with power. Similarly, he resisted the label of nihilism. He did not deny the possibility of resistance, he simply located it. Not in universal principles, but in concrete struggles. For him, resistance does not require foundations. It requires courage, creativity, and experimentation. Another major critique comes from Marxist thinkers. They accuse Foucault of ignoring class, of fragmenting struggles into identity politics, of turning away from the economic structures that underpin power. For Marxists, his emphasis on prisons, sexuality, and discourse seemed like a distraction from the real issue, capitalism. Some went further, accusing him of indirectly serving neoliberalism by undermining grand narratives of revolution. Foucault countered that Marx was useful but insufficient. Power, he argued, is not only economic, it is also medical, educational, sexual, and disciplinary. By expanding the analysis of power, he believed he was enriching, not abandoning, critique. From the liberal side, critics worried about his rejection of universal rights. Philosophers like Jürgen Habermas argued that without universal norms, Foucault's thought devolves into endless suspicion. Habermas wanted a foundation for democracy, rational discourse, and human rights. Foucault, by contrast, saw universal claims as historically contingent and potentially oppressive. For Habermas, this was a dangerous skepticism. For Foucault, it was an honest refusal to disguise power as truth. From the conservative side, Foucault was often seen as corrosive, a destroyer of order. His critiques of prisons, psychiatry, and sexuality threatened institutions that conservatives valued as stabilizing forces. They saw his emphasis on power and exclusion as undermining morality, discipline, and tradition. For them, Foucault symbolized the dangers of relativism in culture and politics. Perhaps the most ironic critique is the misuse of Foucault's ideas. Because he emphasized the ubiquity of power, some readers concluded that resistance is futile, that everything is power and nothing can change. Others used his ideas selectively, applying them to justify extreme forms of skepticism or cynicism. Still others appropriated his critique of universals to attack progressive causes, arguing, for example, that human rights are just another discourse and therefore meaningless. Foucault himself would likely have rejected such uses, since he always paired critique with resistance. But the open-ended nature of his thought made it vulnerable to appropriation. Another line of critique emerged after his death, when aspects of his personal life drew attention. In recent years, controversies have arisen over his writings on sexuality and reports of his behavior in North Africa. These have sparked heated debates about whether his personal actions undermine his philosophical contributions. For some, they raise troubling questions about his legacy. For others, they show the dangers of idolizing intellectuals. Yet despite all these criticisms, Foucault remains unavoidable. Even his critics often acknowledge his brilliance. Habermas, for all his disagreements, admitted that Foucault's genealogies exposed dimensions of power that traditional philosophy had overlooked. Marxists, while frustrated, have integrated his insights into critiques of capitalism. Even scientists skeptical of his relativism acknowledge that his work illuminated the social dimensions of knowledge. In the end, the intensity of the critiques shows the power of Foucault's thought. He was not a philosopher of comfort, but of disturbance. He forced us to confront the fragility of our truths, the constructedness of our norms, the pervasiveness of power. Whether one agrees with him or not, one cannot remain indifferent. His work demands a response. And perhaps, this is the ultimate measure of his legacy. Not that he gave us answers, but that he provoked questions so sharp they continue to divide thinkers today. In the final years of his life, Michel Foucault surprised many of his readers. After decades of analyzing prisons, sexuality, and biopolitics, after relentlessly exposing how power penetrates institutions and bodies, he turned his attention to something that sounded almost ancient, even serene, the care of the self. This shift did not mean abandoning politics. Rather, it was a deepening of his lifelong project, a recognition that freedom is not only about resisting institutions, but also about cultivating new ways of living. The phrase, care of the self, comes from the Greek epimeleia hutu. In his lectures of the early 1980s, Foucault explored how ancient philosophers, particularly the Stoics and Epicureans, saw philosophy not as abstract theory, but as a way of life. To philosophize was to practice self-mastery, reflection, and ethical cultivation. It was to shape oneself, to become free not by escaping power, but by actively engaging in practices of self-formation. Why did Foucault turn to this theme? Part of the reason was his dissatisfaction with the way modern thought had come to frame ethics. Since the Enlightenment, ethics had often been tied to universal rules, laws, or rights. Kant, for example, defined morality in terms of categorical imperatives, abstract principles that apply to all rational beings. But Foucault remained skeptical of universals. He believed that ethics should not be about obeying universal laws, but about creating a style of existence, a practice of freedom. Here, he drew inspiration from antiquity. Ancient philosophy, he argued, was less about rules and more about practices. The Stoics, for instance, recommended daily exercises, writing journals, reflecting on one's actions, meditating on mortality. These were not moral laws, but technologies of the self techniques by which individuals shaped their own subjectivity. For Foucault, this was a model of ethics that resonated with his broader project. The care of the self was not selfishness. It was not about narcissism or withdrawal. It was about cultivating the capacity to resist domination, to live freely, to engage with others responsibly. To care for oneself, in the ancient sense, was to prepare oneself to care for others, to be a responsible citizen, to live truthfully. Ethics, in this sense, was inseparable from politics. This ethical turn also reframed Foucault's earlier analyses of power. If power is everywhere, if it shapes our identities and practices, then resistance cannot simply be about overthrowing power. It must also be about reshaping ourselves, refusing to be defined entirely by norms, creating new ways of being. The care of the self became Foucault's way of naming this task. One of the most striking examples is his work on sexuality in antiquity. In the later volumes of The History of Sexuality, Foucault examined how Greeks and Romans approached sexual practices. Rather than seeing sexuality in terms of identity, gay, straight, etc., they saw it in terms of moderation, self-control, and aesthetics. Sex was part of a broader art of living, a matter of balance and self-mastery. For Foucault, this showed that our modern way of thinking about sexuality, as an identity, a truth about the self, is not inevitable. Other ways of living are possible. This exploration of ancient ethics resonated deeply with his personal life as well. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Foucault immersed himself in the gay community of San Francisco, experiencing the culture of experimentation, community, and new forms of intimacy that flourished there. For him, this was not just pleasure but a philosophical experiment, an attempt to live differently, to create new modes of existence outside traditional norms. The care of the self was both intellectual and embodied, both ancient and contemporary. What makes this turn so powerful is that it refuses despair. After pages and pages of showing how deeply power shapes our lives, one might be tempted to ask, is resistance even possible? The care of the self is Foucault's answer. Yes, power is everywhere, but freedom is possible in how we relate to ourselves. We cannot step outside power, but we can engage it creatively. We can invent ourselves, reshape practices, cultivate ways of life that resist domination. For listeners today, the relevance is profound. In a world saturated with norms, expectations, and pressures, from workplaces to social media, the care of the self offers a way of thinking about freedom that is intimate and practical. It is not about waiting for revolution or relying on universal laws. It is about daily practices, reflection, community, creative self-formation. It is about refusing to let institutions define us completely, about shaping ourselves as acts of resistance. Critics sometimes saw this turn as a retreat from politics, a turn inward. For Foucault, ethics and politics were inseparable. To resist domination requires not only critique of institutions, but also cultivation of subjectivity. To create new societies, we must also create new selves. The care of the self is not an escape from politics, it is its deepest foundation. In the end, Foucault's ethical turn is perhaps his most hopeful contribution. It suggests that even in a world saturated with power, freedom is possible, not as a final liberation, but as a practice, a style, an art of living. And in that sense, it connects Foucault not only to the ancient philosophers he studied, but also to anyone seeking to live truthfully in the face of domination. In his final years, Michel Foucault began speaking about life in a way that startled many of his readers. He described the possibility of shaping existence itself as if it were a work of art. Instead of following fixed moral codes or waiting for liberation from power, he suggested that individuals could treat their lives as creative projects, crafted, refined, and designed with intentionality. This was his notion of the aesthetics of existence. At first glance, the phrase seems almost indulgent, even self-centered. Life as art? It might sound like a call to hedonism or individualism, but for Foucault, this idea had deep philosophical and political significance. It was not about luxury, but about freedom. To live aesthetically was to refuse being reduced to the categories imposed by institutions. It was to invent new ways of being, to create forms of subjectivity that did not simply reproduce domination. Foucault traced this notion back to antiquity, particularly to the Greeks and Romans. In their ethical practices, he found not universal rules, but exercises in self-fashioning. The Stoics, for example, saw philosophy as a way of cultivating a beautiful soul, harmonizing thought and action. Sexual practices were not defined by moral absolutes, but by questions of balance, moderation, and self-mastery. One lived one's life as a craftsman shapes a statue, carefully, intentionally, aiming for coherence and beauty. This aesthetic approach to existence, Foucault argued, was largely lost in modern times. Christianity reframed ethics around obedience to universal laws, shifting focus from self-fashioning to confession and guilt. Modernity continued this trend by tying ethics to universal principles like human rights or rational duties. Foucault did not dismiss these frameworks entirely, but he saw them as limiting. They reduced ethics to rules, stripping away the creative, experimental dimension of living. By reviving the idea of aesthetics of existence, he sought to recover a more open form of ethics. Instead of asking, what is the right rule to follow, we might ask, what kind of life do I want to create? What practices can help me live more freely, more truthfully, more beautifully? Ethics, in this sense, becomes a matter of artistry, not obedience. This idea resonated strongly with Foucault's personal experiences in the gay community of San Francisco. There, he witnessed and participated in experiments with identity, intimacy, and lifestyle that defied traditional norms. These were not simply private pleasures, they were acts of invention. To live openly, to create new forms of relationships, to challenge established categories. This was the aesthetics of existence in practice. It was a refusal to accept the world's definitions of normality, and a commitment to shaping life differently. The aesthetics of existence also reframed resistance. If power is everywhere, then resistance cannot be about overthrowing it once and for all. Instead, resistance must be woven into life itself, into the ways we speak, love, work, and care for ourselves. By living aesthetically, by crafting life intentionally, we resist the reduction of subjectivity to categories of normality. Freedom becomes less about a final victory and more about the ongoing creation of existence as a work of art. Critics worried that this turn reduced politics to personal lifestyle, that it encouraged self-indulgence rather than collective struggle. But Foucault saw no such divide. For him, personal practices of freedom were inherently political, because they challenged norms that govern populations. When individuals live differently, they destabilize the categories through which power operates. To live aesthetically is to live politically, even if in small, everyday acts. One of Foucault's most striking formulations came in an interview where he said, "What strikes me is the fact that, in our society, art has become something which is related only to objects and not to individuals or to life. But couldn't everyone's life become a work of art? Why should the lamp or the house be an art object, but not our life?" Here, he revealed the heart of his vision. Ethics is not just about rules or prohibitions. It is about treating life itself as a canvas, shaping it deliberately, creatively, responsibly. For listeners today, this idea resonates in powerful ways. In a world of constant surveillance, standardized careers, and algorithmically shaped identities, the call to live life as a work of art is both inspiring and subversive. It suggests that freedom is not an abstract ideal, but a daily practice of self-creation. It invites us to refuse conformity, to experiment with ways of living, to see existence itself as an act of resistance. This does not mean life becomes easy. Art requires discipline, patience, effort. To craft a life is to face conflict, risk, and uncertainty. But for Foucault, that was precisely the point. Freedom is not about safety or certainty, it is about creativity. It is about refusing to live by default, choosing instead to shape life with intention. In the end, the aesthetics of existence is Foucault's most poetic idea. It offers a vision of freedom not as liberation from power, but as artistry within it. It suggests that the ultimate resistance to normalization is not destruction, but creation. The creation of lives that are unique, beautiful, and ungovernable. And perhaps this was Foucault's final gift, the reminder that philosophy is not just analysis of systems, but a call to live differently, to treat life itself as the canvas of freedom. By the early 1980s, Michel Foucault had become one of the most recognizable intellectuals in the world. His lectures at the Collège de France drew overflowing crowds. His books were translated into dozens of languages. His concepts, discipline, biopolitics, governmentality, were reshaping debates across philosophy, sociology, political science, and history. Yet, even as his influence reached its height, his health began to falter. What followed was a period of intense productivity shadowed by illness, a final chapter in which life, thought, and mortality collided. Foucault's declining health was the result of what the world would soon come to know as AIDS, though in the early 1980s it was still a poorly understood disease. He had been deeply immersed in the gay communities of Paris and San Francisco, spaces that became both sites of joy and sites of risk as the epidemic spread. At the time, few knew what caused the illness or how it spread. What was clear was that it was devastating entire communities, and that stigma and silence surrounded it. Foucault never spoke publicly about his illness. To this day, scholars debate whether this silence was intentional, strategic, or simply personal. Some argue that his refusal to disclose was consistent with his lifelong resistance to confession, his rejection of the idea that truth must be told about the self. Others see it as a tragic missed opportunity, a moment when his voice could have contributed to the growing political struggle around AIDS. Whatever the case, his illness remained largely unacknowledged during his lifetime, though those close to him knew. Yet far from slowing down, Foucault's productivity during these years was astonishing. Between 1981 and 1984, he produced some of his most important works, including The Use of Pleasure and the Care of the Self, the second and third volumes of the History of Sexuality. He also delivered lectures that would later be published as The Hermeneutics of the Subject and The Courage of Truth. In these texts, he turned increasingly toward ethics, ancient philosophy, and the idea of life as a work of art. His thought was maturing, expanding, even as his body weakened. There is something haunting about this. As his own life was threatened by illness, he turned to themes of mortality, care of the self, and truth-telling. He explored how ancient philosophers practiced meditation on death as a way of living freely. He examined how parrhesia, fearless speech, required courage in the face of danger. These were not abstract academic exercises. They were reflections forged in the shadow of mortality. Friends and colleagues later recalled his extraordinary energy during this period. Despite frequent hospitalizations, he continued to teach, write, and debate. He traveled, lectured, and participated in intellectual life with vigor. Those who knew him described a sense of urgency, as if he knew time was short and every moment mattered. When Foucault died on June 25, 1984, at the age of 57, the news stunned the intellectual world. The official cause was listed as a neurological illness, but it quickly became clear that he had died of AIDS-related complications. He was one of the first major public figures in France to die of the disease, though his family and publisher at first downplayed the fact. In the years that followed, as the epidemic became impossible to ignore, his death took on symbolic significance. Foucault's silence about AIDS was itself seen as part of the story, a reflection of the stigma, fear, and uncertainty that surrounded the disease in its early years. In retrospect, his final works read with an added poignancy. His meditations on the care of the self, on the courage of truth, on the aesthetics of existence, are inseparable from the context of his illness. His insistence that life should be lived as a work of art takes on new urgency when we remember that he was writing under the shadow of death. His exploration of how ancient philosophers faced mortality was not detached scholarship, but lived philosophy. Foucault's death also marked the end of an intellectual trajectory that was still unfolding. He had plans for further volumes of the history of sexuality, exploring early Christianity and the development of confession. He had begun new lectures on Parrhesia that suggested directions his thought might have taken toward a deeper philosophy of truth-telling, ethics, and political courage. We can only speculate how his ideas might have developed had he lived longer. But perhaps the most striking aspect of Foucault's final years is how seamlessly his life and thought came together. He did not retreat from philosophy when illness struck. He did not turn away from the themes of power, freedom, and ethics that had defined his career. Instead, he lived them, embodied them, and left us with a vision of philosophy as something more than theory. For him, philosophy was a way of confronting mortality, of living truthfully, of shaping existence even in the face of death. For listeners today, his final years are a reminder of philosophy's deepest purpose. It is about how we live, how we face suffering, how we meet death. Foucault's final works invite us to see freedom not as a distant dream, but as a practice, lived daily even, perhaps especially, when life itself is fragile. By the time of his death in 1984, Michel Foucault had become one of the most cited, debated, and polarizing figures in philosophy. His concepts, disciplinary power, biopolitics, governmentality, the care of the self reshaped not only academic debates, but also broader cultural conversations. His influence spread across philosophy, history, sociology, political science, gender studies, and even literature. Yet his legacy has always been contested, precisely because he disrupted so many established frameworks. In the decades after his death, Foucault was often grouped under the broad and somewhat slippery label of postmodernism. This term came to signify skepticism toward grand narratives, suspicion of universals, and a focus on power, discourse, and identity. Foucault himself rejected the label. He did not see himself as postmodern, preferring to describe his work as critical history or philosophical archaeology. Yet the association stuck, largely because his critiques resonated with postmodern themes. What made Foucault postmodern, in the eyes of many, was his refusal to ground philosophy in universal truth. Where Enlightenment thinkers sought reason as a foundation, Foucault insisted that reason itself is historically contingent. Where Marxists sought class struggle as the key to history, Foucault emphasized a multiplicity of struggles across prisons, hospitals, sexuality, and schools. Where liberals sought universal rights, he exposed the ways rights discourse could also be instruments of exclusion. This relentless refusal of foundations made him both admired and feared. One of his most enduring contributions is his analysis of power. Before Foucault, power was often understood primarily in terms of sovereignty, the ruler who commands, the state that enforces, the law that forbids. Foucault broadened this vision. Power, he argued, is not just top-down but also diffuse, operating through institutions, norms, and everyday practices. It is productive as well as repressive. It creates knowledge, identities, categories, and truths. This shift transformed the study of politics and society, opening new avenues of research and critique. For philosophers, this meant a profound reorientation. Instead of searching for universal structures of knowledge or morality, many followed Foucault in examining the historical conditions under which truths are produced. This gave rise to new fields like science and technology studies, which analyze how scientific facts are shaped by social contexts, and critical legal studies, which investigate how law functions as a tool of power. In gender studies and queer theory, scholars used Foucault's insights to show how sexual and gender identities are not natural givens, but historically contingent constructs. But Foucault's legacy is not only about ideas, it is about method. His genealogical approach encouraged scholars to dig into archives, to trace the contingent histories of concepts we take for granted. Madness, punishment, sexuality. These were not timeless realities, but outcomes of struggles, decisions, and discourses. Genealogy became a way of unsettling what seems natural, reminding us that the present could have been otherwise, and therefore can be changed. This legacy, however, has always been controversial. Critics like Jürgen Habermas accused Foucault of undermining the Enlightenment project, of abandoning the quest for rational foundations of democracy and justice. Habermas argued that without universal principles, critique collapses into relativism. Others, especially Marxist thinkers, worried that Foucault's emphasis on diffuse power distracted from capitalism as the central structure of domination. Still others saw his skepticism as corrosive, feeding cynicism rather than hope. Yet defenders of Foucault argue that his very refusal of foundations is what makes his work powerful. By rejecting universals, he opened space for plural struggles. By exposing the historical contingency of norms, he made change imaginable. By showing that power is everywhere, he also showed that resistance is everywhere. Far from being nihilistic, his thought is deeply political, a call to fight on multiple fronts, to resist domination wherever it occurs. The debate over Foucault's legacy also reveals something about philosophy itself. Traditionally, philosophy has sought truth, foundations, certainty. Foucault shifted the task toward critique, toward unsettling assumptions, toward analyzing how truths are produced. In this sense, he belongs in a line with Nietzsche and Heidegger philosophers who dismantled certainties rather than built systems. For admirers, this makes him one of the great philosophers of suspicion. For critics, it makes him a destroyer rather than a builder. What cannot be denied is his impact. Few philosophers since the mid-20th century have been cited more widely. Few have generated as many debates, conferences, and reinterpretations. Few have influenced so many fields at once. Even those who reject him often define themselves against him, proving his inescapability. For listeners today, his legacy in philosophy invites us to reflect on the role of critique. Do we need universal truths to resist oppression, or can we rely on local, situated struggles? Do we need foundations for morality, or can we live ethically through practices of freedom? Do we need certainty, or can philosophy embrace contingency? These questions remain alive precisely because Foucault left them unresolved. Perhaps that is the essence of his legacy, not to give us answers, but to sharpen our sense of the problems. He left philosophy less secure, less certain, but also more alive, more attuned to the complexities of power, knowledge, and freedom. Michel Foucault's influence was never confined to the ivory towers of philosophy. In fact, one of the most remarkable aspects of his legacy is how far his concepts traveled beyond academic philosophy into sociology, political science, law, education, and even popular culture. His work became a toolbox, a set of concepts that could be applied to fields far beyond the study of history and ideas. Few philosophers of the 20th century have had such wide-ranging impact. In sociology, Foucault reshaped the way scholars understood institutions and social order. Before him, many sociologists focused on structures like class or formal organizations. Foucault expanded the field's gaze to include the micro-level mechanisms of power, surveillance, discipline, normalization. His analysis of prisons, schools, and hospitals revealed how modern institutions shape individuals, not just through explicit rules, but through subtle routines and expectations. Concepts like disciplinary society and panopticism became staples of sociological theory, used to analyze everything from workplace management to digital surveillance. In political science, his notion of governmentality opened entirely new approaches to governance. Traditionally, political science focused on states, elections, and policies. Foucault showed that governing goes far beyond laws and institutions. It includes the management of populations, the shaping of behavior, the structuring of choices. Political scientists adopted his framework to study welfare systems, public health, security regimes, and even environmental policies. His insights proved especially useful in analyzing neoliberalism, where governance often operates by encouraging individuals to regulate themselves according to market logic. In law and criminology, Foucault's discipline and punish had seismic effects. It challenged conventional narratives that saw modern prisons as progress compared to older forms of punishment. Instead, Foucault showed that prisons were part of a broader system of discipline, producing docile subjects through surveillance and normalization. Criminologists and legal scholars used his insights to critique mass incarceration, policing practices, and the expansion of carceral logic into schools, immigration systems, and social services. His work fueled movements for prison abolition and restorative justice, showing that punishment is not just about crime, but about power. In education, his analysis of discipline illuminated how schools function not just to transmit knowledge, but to shape behavior. The regimented schedules, constant testing, hierarchical authority, these features create students who are punctual, obedient, and productive. Educational theorists used Foucault's concepts to critique standardized testing, classroom surveillance, and the way schools reproduce social inequalities. His work continues to influence debates about pedagogy, student autonomy, and the politics of curriculum design. In cultural studies, Foucault's impact has been profound. His idea that power produces identity became foundational for analyzing race, gender, sexuality, and media. Cultural theorists drew on his notion of discourse to examine how categories like normal and deviant are constructed through film, literature, advertising, and news. His concept of biopolitics informed critiques of how popular culture shapes ideas of health, beauty, and bodies. From body image in fashion magazines to the representation of queerness in television, Foucault's ideas offered critical tools for understanding culture as a field of power. Even popular activism absorbed his language. Terms like disciplinary power and biopolitics entered activist circles, particularly in struggles around prisons, healthcare, sexuality, and human rights. Feminist and queer activists used his critique of sexuality to challenge medical pathologization and legal regulation of desire. Anti-racist movements used his analysis of surveillance to expose policing and state control of minority populations. Environmental activists drew on biopolitics to show how entire ecosystems are managed for human benefit, often at great cost. Perhaps most surprisingly, Foucault also influenced art and literature. Artists and writers used his concepts of discourse, power, and subjectivity to explore how identities are constructed and contested. Novelists drew inspiration from his genealogical method, crafting narratives that expose hidden histories of oppression. Visual artists created works that dramatized the dynamics of surveillance and control. His presence can be felt in film studies, theater, architecture, and even music, wherever questions of power and identity are explored. Of course, his influence was not always straightforward. Some applications of Foucault oversimplified his ideas, reducing complex analyses to slogans. Others used his work in ways he might have resisted, applying it to contexts far removed from his own concerns. But this too is part of his legacy. His thought was not a system to be followed, but a set of tools to be used, adapted, and reimagined. He once said, "I don't write to say what is true, but to show how things could be otherwise." That spirit of experimentation explains why his work spread so widely. For listeners today, the breadth of Foucault's influence is striking. He is not a philosopher one can leave on the shelf. His concepts continue to shape debates in classrooms, courtrooms, boardrooms, and protest movements. Whenever we ask how institutions shape us, how norms govern us, how identities are constructed, we are working in Foucault's shadow, even if we don't realize it. And that may be his greatest legacy outside philosophy. He taught us that power is not only in the state, not only in law, not only in economics, it is in culture, in knowledge, in everyday life. By making power visible where it was once invisible, he gave generations of thinkers and activists new ways to see, critique, and resist the world around them. If there is one area where Michel Foucault's work feels uncannily prophetic, it is in the realm of surveillance and security. His analysis of prisons, discipline, and the panopticon, Jeremy Bentham's model of a prison where a single guard could watch all inmates without being seen, has become a touchstone for understanding the 21st century. Today, when governments and corporations track our data, when cameras line our streets, and when our phones monitor our every move, Foucault's insights ring louder than ever. In Discipline and Punish, 1975, Foucault argued that modern societies had shifted from spectacular forms of punishment, public executions, torture, to subtle forms of control that operate through constant observation. The panopticon was his metaphor for this shift. In a panoptic system, the possibility of being watched is enough to discipline individuals. People internalize the gaze of authority, regulating themselves even when no one is looking. This, he argued, is how modern power operates, not through brute force, but through surveillance that becomes self-surveillance. Fast forward to the digital age, and the metaphor feels less like a metaphor and more like reality. Governments monitor internet traffic, collect metadata, and use facial recognition technologies. Corporations track browsing histories, purchases, and even biometric data. Social media platforms encourage users to curate their own lives for public display, creating a culture where self-surveillance becomes normalized. We watch ourselves, anticipating the gaze of others, just as Foucault predicted. This is not just about technology, it's about politics. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, states around the world expanded surveillance powers in the name of security. Airports became sites of intense monitoring. Intelligence agencies grew their capacity to track communications. Entire populations found themselves under watch. Foucault's concept of security apparatuses, mechanisms designed not to eliminate risks but to manage them, captures this perfectly. States no longer promise safety, they promise to monitor, predict, and contain threats. Risk management becomes the new form of governance. Consider predictive policing, where algorithms analyze crime data to forecast where future crimes might occur. Or consider public health surveillance, where governments track infections, vaccination rates, and even genetic information. These practices exemplify what Foucault called the shift from sovereign power, the right to take life, to biopolitical power, which seeks to manage populations, optimize life, and regulate health. Security is not about preventing danger, absolutely. It is about governing life by calculating probabilities, managing flows, and controlling risks. This raises pressing political questions. If we are constantly monitored, where does freedom lie? If states and corporations know more about our behavior than we do, what happens to autonomy? If power operates not through coercion, but through subtle nudges, how do we recognize when we are being governed? Foucault gives us the tools to ask these questions, even if he does not provide definitive answers. Foucault also helps us see how surveillance intertwines with inequality. Surveillance is rarely neutral. Marginalized groups are more heavily monitored: immigrants at borders, racial minorities in cities, the poor in welfare systems. The very technologies of security reproduce hierarchies, deciding whose risks matter and whose lives are expendable. This connects directly to his insight that biopolitics involves making live and letting die. Security is not evenly distributed. It protects some while exposing others to neglect or danger. Critics of mass surveillance often invoke Foucault directly. Edward Snowden, in his revelations about the National Security Agency, echoed Foucault's concerns about the panopticon when he described how people censor themselves once they know they are being watched. Activists fighting facial recognition software and predictive policing cite discipline and punish as a key text for understanding how surveillance disciplines entire populations. Foucault's work, written in the 1970s, has become a guide for navigating the politics of the digital age. Yet his relevance is not limited to surveillance. His broader insights into governmentality, the ways power shapes behavior through freedom rather than coercion, apply directly to contemporary politics. Consider how governments encourage citizens to monitor their own carbon footprints, or how health systems rely on individuals to track their diet and exercise. These are forms of governance that rely on self-regulation, making individuals responsible for problems that are often structural. Foucault helps us see how these strategies work, and why they can be so effective. For listeners today, the challenge is to recognize that surveillance and security are not aberrations, but central features of modern governance. They are not simply tools of oppression, they are also systems of management, embedded in everyday life. This makes them harder to resist, but also more urgent to analyze. And this is where Foucault leaves us with a paradox. Surveillance disciplines us, but it also makes resistance possible. By exposing how surveillance works, we can begin to imagine alternatives, new forms of privacy, new practices of freedom, new ways of organizing security that do not rely on constant monitoring. The question is not whether surveillance exists, but how we respond to it, how we live within it, and how we resist its most oppressive forms. In this sense, Foucault remains one of the most relevant political thinkers of our time. He did not predict the internet, smartphones, or algorithms, but he gave us the concepts to understand them. He showed that power operates not only through laws and armies, but through the subtle shaping of everyday life, and in doing so, he prepared us for the political challenges of the 21st century. Michel Foucault's writings were designed as tools, what he once called a toolbox for critique. He never offered them as a finished system or dogma. He encouraged readers to pick up his concepts, use them, adapt them, even discard them when they no longer worked. In this sense, his philosophy was deliberately open-ended. Yet this very openness also made his thought vulnerable to misappropriation. Over the decades since his death, his ideas have been invoked, distorted, and fought over in political battles across the ideological spectrum. Perhaps the most striking misappropriation comes from the political right. In recent years, conservative critics have blamed Foucault and postmodern theory more broadly for what they see as the erosion of truth and morality. They argue that by claiming truth is bound up with power, Foucault opened the door to relativism, cynicism, and post-truth politics. In some circles, he has even been linked to the rise of conspiracy thinking and distrust of science. Ironically, ideas meant to expose domination have been cast as the cause of social decay. In the United States, debates about critical theory and woke culture often drag Foucault into the fray. Critics accuse his thought of fueling identity politics, undermining objective standards, and destabilizing Western values. His critique of sexuality and normalization has been cited as the intellectual root of gender theory, queer theory, and contemporary debates over trans rights topics that have become lightning rods in culture wars. For conservative commentators, Foucault is not just a philosopher, but a symbol of everything destabilizing about modern culture. But misappropriation has also come from unexpected quarters. Some neoliberals have cited his rejection of universal truths as an implicit endorsement of market pluralism. If there are no universals, then perhaps the market is the best mechanism for managing diversity. Foucault himself did analyze neoliberal thinkers sympathetically, showing how they framed freedom in market terms. Yet he did so critically, not as endorsement. Still, fragments of his work have been lifted out of context to justify policies he would likely have opposed. Even within left-wing movements, Foucault has been a source of controversy. Activists inspired by his critiques of power have sometimes adopted his ideas in ways that paralyze collective action. If power is everywhere, some ask, then what's the point of resistance? If all claims to truth are bound up with power, then what makes our resistance better than the systems we oppose? These dilemmas show how his thought, when misunderstood, can feed into pessimism or political fragmentation. Another dimension of political battle concerns his personal life and posthumous reputation. In the 2020s, resurfaced claims about his behavior in North Africa reignited debates about whether his personal actions undermine his intellectual legacy. Critics argued that his writings on sexuality were compromised by personal conduct, while defenders warned against collapsing philosophy into biography. These debates reflect larger cultural struggles over how to remember intellectuals, how to separate, or not separate ideas from individuals. Academic battles have been just as fierce. In philosophy departments, Foucault has been a lightning rod between analytic and continental traditions. Analytic philosophers often criticized his style as opaque and his arguments as vague. Continental thinkers, by contrast, celebrated his ability to open new terrains of thought. The divide was not merely stylistic, but political. Was philosophy about building rigorous arguments, or about disrupting power? Foucault became the stand-in for the latter. The most enduring political struggle over Foucault concerns his relation to truth. Critics accuse him of undermining the very possibility of truth, fueling the relativism of the post-truth era. But defenders argue the opposite, that his work is essential, precisely because it shows how truth can be manipulated, how institutions produce regimes of knowledge, how claims to neutrality often mask domination. In this reading, Foucault is not the enemy of truth, but its most important defender, because he forces us to ask who gets to define it, and in whose interests. What is remarkable is how a thinker who died in 1984 continues to ignite such intense political battles. His ideas about surveillance, sexuality, biopolitics, and governmentality are not abstract relics. They are alive in debates about healthcare, policing, identity, and freedom. His name is invoked in legislatures, classrooms, newsrooms, and protests. Few philosophers of the 20th century have been so contested, so polarizing, and yet so indispensable. For listeners today, this tells us something vital. Foucault's philosophy was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to disturb, to unsettle, to make us see the world differently. That is why it is misappropriated and fought over. It is dangerous precisely because it refuses to give easy answers. And that, perhaps, is why it remains so powerful. When Michel Foucault died in 1984, his funeral in Paris drew crowds of friends, colleagues, and admirers. He was buried quietly in Vendouvre, du Poitou, far from the academic spotlight, but his intellectual presence never left. In fact, it only grew. Today, nearly 4 decades later, his writings remain among the most cited in the humanities and social sciences. His concepts circulate in classrooms, courtrooms, news reports, activist movements, and even casual debates about surveillance or sexuality. His legacy is not contained in books on dusty shelves. It is alive in the world around us. And yet, Foucault never wanted disciples. He often resisted labels, even the term philosopher. He once said, "Do not ask me who I am, and do not ask me to remain the same." His thought was not a closed system, but a practice of questioning, a method of critique. His enduring contribution is less a set of doctrines and more a way of thinking. A suspicion of what is taken for granted, a willingness to dig into the history of ideas, a refusal to accept truth without asking who benefits from it. The question that runs through his work is simple but unsettling. How are we governed, and how might we live differently? It is a question that cannot be answered once and for all. It must be asked again in each generation, in each context, in each life. For Foucault, freedom was not about escaping power altogether. That was impossible. Freedom was about practicing resistance within power, creating spaces of autonomy, experimenting with new ways of being. It was about transforming life into something that could not be easily captured by norms. This is why his thought continues to resonate. In an age of digital surveillance, his analysis of the panopticon helps us understand how we internalize the gaze of authority. In debates about health, sexuality, and identity, his notion of biopolitics shows how bodies and desires are governed. In struggles for racial justice, gender equality, and LGBTQ+ rights, his insights into normalization illuminate how exclusion works and how it can be resisted. His questions remain alive wherever people challenge the systems that shape them. But perhaps the most provocative aspect of his legacy is that it offers no guarantees. Foucault never promised that resistance would succeed, that truth would triumph, or that liberation was inevitable. He left us instead with a practice of vigilance: look closer, ask harder, uncover the hidden workings of power. It is a philosophy that demands courage, because it denies us the comfort of certainty. And yet it is also a philosophy of hope, because it insists that things could always be otherwise. So the story of Michel Foucault does not end with his death. It continues in the questions we ask, in the practices we invent, in the ways we resist and create. His life, marked by brilliance and controversy, illness and resilience, was itself a kind of experiment, a work of art shaped under the shadow of mortality. He showed us that philosophy is not just theory, but a way of living, of confronting power, of caring for the self, of speaking truth in the face of danger. And as we reflect on his legacy, we are left with a question that might be his greatest gift. If power is everywhere, how will we choose to live within it? That question does not close the story. It opens it, for us, for now, for the future.